She pressed her body flat against the rotting wood of the chicken coop wall and told herself it wasn't stealing if a person was desperate enough to die without it. Her hands shook so badly she nearly crushed the first egg before she even got it free from the hay. 2 days without food. 2 days since Horace Bell had walked off her father's land with a piece of paper she still didn't fully understand, and a smile she would never forget. Rebecca Holloway was 26 years old, and she was about to steal breakfast from a man she'd never met because pride, she had learned, was a luxury that belonged to people who still had something left to lose. If this story already has your heart, please subscribe to this channel right now and drop your city in the comments below. I read every single one, and there is nothing that humbles me more than knowing how far these stories travel. Now stay with me, because what happens next in that chicken coop is going to change everything you think you know about this woman and the man who found her there. Rebecca Holloway had not cried since the morning they buried her father. She had stood at that grave in her best dress, the dark blue one her mother had sewn 12 years before her own death, and she had held herself together with the same quiet discipline Samuel Holloway had spent a lifetime trying to teach her. Don't let them see you break, Becca. People will take whatever you show them and use it against you later. She hadn't cried when the preacher said his words. She hadn't cried when the neighbors drifted back to their wagons without meeting her eyes. She hadn't even cried 3 days later when Horace Bell arrived at the farm with 2 of his hired men and a piece of paper he called a final notice of debt collection. She had read that paper 4 times, standing in the doorway. Then she had looked up at Bell and said, very quietly, "My father paid this loan. I watched him do it." Bell had smiled the way men smile when they already know the ending of a story and the other person doesn't. "I'm afraid the records show otherwise, Miss Holloway." "Then your records are wrong. Then you're welcome to dispute them in a court of law." He had tucked his thumbs into his vest pockets, the gesture of a man completely comfortable inside his own authority. In the meantime, this property legally transfers to the Bell Merchant and Land Trust effective the 1st of next month. You have 3 weeks to remove your belongings. She had not cried then either. She had gone inside, sat down at her father's kitchen table, and pressed both palms flat against the wood he had built with his own hands 30 years ago, and she breathed. She breathed until the shaking stopped. Then she got up and started packing. That had been 11 days ago. Now she was crouched inside a stranger's chicken coop in the Montana mountains, with 3 warm eggs cupped against her chest, like they were the most precious things in the world, because at this particular moment, they were. She had walked out of Alder Creek with everything she owned stuffed into one battered canvas bag. 2 dresses, her mother's sewing kit, her father's account ledger, a handful of dried beans she'd boiled and eaten on the second day, and a little under $2 in coin that had been reduced to 37 cents after she paid for one night at a roadside way station. The shoes on her feet had a split along the left sole that let in every rock and root on the mountain trail. Her hem was thick with trail dust, and the hunger had stopped feeling like pain somewhere around yesterday noon and had become something stranger, a hollow steadiness that made her movements feel slightly disconnected from her body, like she was watching herself from a short distance away. She had seen the smoke from the chimney before she saw the house, had stopped on the ridge trail and stared down into the valley the way a person stares at a mirage, with desperate hope and absolute suspicion in equal measure. The homestead was large, larger than anything she had expected this deep into the mountain timber. A proper log house with a covered porch, a solid barn, a corral holding 4 horses that moved with the easy confidence of well-kept animals. Cattle somewhere farther down the valley. She could hear them faintly on the wind. Cleared ground. A kitchen garden surrounded by a good fence, and a chicken coop set beside the barn, its door latched with a simple wooden toggle. She had stood on that ridge for a long time, long enough to know that what she was considering was wrong. She had never stolen anything in her life. Her father had raised her with a bone-deep conviction about property and honesty that she had never once questioned, because she had never once needed to. The Holloways had always had enough. Not wealth, nothing like wealth, but enough. Enough flour, enough firewood, Enough dried meat in the cellar to see them through a hard winter. Enough had always been sufficient for a woman who had learned from her mother that gratitude was a form of wealth no one could foreclose on. But her mother had also never gone 2 days without eating. Rebecca unlatched the chicken coop toggle. The hens shifted and muttered in the dim interior, the warm smell of hay and feathers thick around her. She moved slowly, the way her father had taught her to move around nervous animals. Low and steady, no sudden gestures. The nearest hen regarded her with one amber eye, and then looked away, apparently deciding she was not particularly interesting. Rebecca reached carefully under the hen's warm body, and her fingers found 2 eggs. She shifted to the next nest. 1 more. 3 eggs. She was pressing them against her chest with both hands, already calculating how long it would take her to reach a place where she could build a small fire without being seen from the trail, when the voice came from the doorway behind her. Planning on paying for those? It was the deepest voice she had heard in her life. Not loud, it wasn't raised at all, but it had a quality to it that seemed to reach through the walls of the coop and press against the air itself. Rebecca froze. The eggs were warm against her palms. She did not drop them. She turned around slowly, the way she imagined a person turns around when they already know the next few seconds are going to determine the rest of their life. He filled the doorway. That was the only way to describe it. Not stood in the doorway, filled it, the way a mountain fills a horizon, the way a storm fills a sky. He was the tallest man she had ever seen, with shoulders so broad that both sides of the door frame were within inches of his arms. Long black hair hung loose around his face, and his beard was thick and dark and unkempt in the way of a man who had no one to keep a mirror for. His skin was tan, the deep brown of someone who spent most of his life outdoors, and his arms, bare below the sleeveless brown leather vest he wore over a plain work shirt, were knotted with muscle in a way that suggested not vanity, but decades of genuine physical labor. He wore leather trousers, heavy boots, and a small tool pouch at his hip. No hat. No rifle in his hands, though she had no doubt there was one somewhere within reach. His eyes were dark and still. They moved from her face to her hands, to the eggs, back to her face. Rebecca waited for the anger, for the shout, for the rough hand grabbing her arm and the threat of the sheriff. She had constructed this scenario in the back of her mind the whole time she had been crossing the yard, had told herself it was a risk she was willing to accept, because the alternative was collapsing on the mountain trail before she reached the next settlement. She was prepared to be caught. She was not prepared for what happened instead. He looked at her shoes. He looked at the eggs. He looked at her hands, which were shaking, and she hated that they were shaking, hated that he could see it, hated the naked desperation of the whole moment with every fiber of pride she still possessed. And then he simply turned around and walked out. Over his shoulder, without looking back, he said, "Come inside." Rebecca stood in the chicken coop for another 3 seconds. Then she put the eggs back. She pressed each one carefully back into the nests, smoothed the hay around them, and walked out into the afternoon light. He was already crossing toward the house. He didn't look back to see if she was following. She wasn't sure if that was confidence or indifference. She followed anyway, because 37 cents and splitting shoes and a hollow place behind her ribs that used to be her appetite didn't leave a great deal of room for dignity. The inside of the house was plain and spare and absolutely clean. Not the aggressive cleanliness of a woman trying to hold something together, but the functional order of a person who simply could not tolerate chaos. A large stone fireplace, a heavy wooden table with 4 chairs, shelves of tools, dried goods, rope and hardware arranged with the same unsentimental precision as the rest of the property. The kitchen area held a good iron stove, a proper dry sink, a solid pantry cabinet. Everything worked. Everything had a place. But the flowers on the table were wilting in their jar, and the bread from what must have been 2 or 3 days ago sat half-wrapped in cloth. And there was a general feeling of a house that had all the right materials, but was missing whatever it was that made a house function like a home. He set a pot on the stove without speaking, stoked the firebox. The beef stew was already made. She could smell it. And he simply warmed it and ladled a full bowl and set it in front of her, along with a thick slice of bread that was stale at the edges, but still good in the middle, and a cup of water. He poured none for himself. He sat across the table with his arms folded on the surface and watched the window while she ate, giving her the privacy of not being observed. She ate the entire bowl. She was embarrassed by how fast she ate it, and by the fact that she briefly considered asking for more before she caught herself. She pressed her hand flat on the table and breathed, and reminded herself that she still had manners, even if she presently had nothing else. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for the first time since they sat down. His dark eyes were steady and direct in the way of a man who had no patience for indirection, but there was no cruelty in them. "Name," he said. "Rebecca Holloway, from Alder Creek." She paused. "My father was Samuel Holloway. He died 6 weeks ago. Horace Bell claimed a debt against the farm that I believe was fabricated. I have no way to prove it yet. I left town because—" She stopped herself. Because she had started rattling facts, like a woman trying to establish her innocence in advance, and she disliked that impulse in herself. She started again. "I left because I had nowhere to stay and no money to pay for board, and I couldn't afford to remain somewhere I owed anyone a debt I couldn't repay." Howe was quiet for a moment. "Silas Boone," he said. It had the tone of a man who did not often introduce himself, because most people already knew who he was. She didn't recognize the name. Or rather, she recognized it distantly, the way you recognize a rumor. She had heard people in town say the name in the same tone they used for weather coming over the mountain. Something large, something to be respected from a distance. "How long since you ate?" he said. "Yesterday morning, beans. I had a small fire on the trail." He nodded once. The acknowledgement of a man filing information. "Bell," he said after a moment. "He's made 2 offers on my South Valley, water rights and the wagon route. I've refused both." His voice was flat and factual. No rage in it, no injury. Just information delivered in the same steady register as everything else he said. That makes 2 people at this table with reason to be interested in what Bell is doing. Rebecca looked at him. "You think I might have evidence? I think a man who builds fraud needs paper to do it. And I think a woman who kept her father's accounts would know what papers matter." He unfolded his arms and set his hands flat on the table. They were enormous hands, scarred along the knuckles, calloused in the patterns of a man who worked with rope and wood and iron. "I need someone to run this house, keep supply records, feed the hands come September when the seasonal crew arrives. It's honest work and it pays a wage I'll put in writing." Rebecca was quiet. She was calculating. She could not help calculating. It was the way her mind had always worked. The variables of the offer. Wages. Safety. Distance from Alder Creek. Time to examine her father's documents properly. She had carried that ledger the entire way from the farm because she had not been able to make herself leave it behind. Some instinct telling her it mattered even when she couldn't articulate exactly how. "And the second option?" she said, because something in his delivery had suggested there was one. He looked at her directly, not with the calculated appraisal of a man sizing up a transaction. With the plain, unflinching honesty of a man who had decided to say a thing and was going to say it without ornamentation. "Or wear white beside me forever." The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Rebecca set down her cup. "Are you asking me to marry you?" It was not entirely a question. It was more the sound of a mind attempting to locate the frame around something that had no obvious frame. "Giving you 2 choices," Silas said. "Honest work, or an honest marriage. You don't know me. I know enough." He said it without arrogance, as simple statement. "I know you put those eggs back." She had not expected that. She felt something shift slightly in her chest, some tight thing loosening a fraction of an inch, and she pressed it back down. "I put them back because I heard you coming, and I was caught." "You put them back because it was wrong, and you knew it, and knowing it mattered to you more than being hungry." He held her gaze steadily. "Most people I've met would have kept walking with the eggs and dealt with the shame later. You didn't." Rebecca looked at her hands. "An honest marriage to a man I met 40 minutes ago." "I'm not asking you to love me today," Silas said. I'm asking you to consider the possibility of building something honest with someone who isn't going to pretend your situation is anything other than what it is, and who isn't going to hold it over you once your circumstances change. And what if they don't change? Then you'll have worked for wages and lived in a clean house, and nobody in this valley will touch you, and that's better than the mountain trail. She looked up at him. Why? She said. Why offer either thing to a woman you found stealing from your chicken coop? Silas was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped in the stove. Outside the window, the evening was settling into the pine timber. Because I've been alone on this land for 9 years, he said, and I am tired of it. And because anyone desperate enough to steal 3 eggs and honest enough to put them back when they didn't have to is the kind of person I'd rather have across my table than most of the ones I've met in town. He pushed back from the table slightly, giving her the physical space that the conversation seemed to require. I won't press you. Think on it tonight. There's a room at the end of the hall. Lock doesn't work on it. I'll fix it tomorrow. You have my word. Nothing in this house will be asked of you that isn't agreed to in advance. Rebecca sat at that table for a long time after he went out to do the evening chores. She sat with the empty bowl in front of her and her hands folded in her lap, and she thought about her father, about the farm. About the morning Horace Bell had stood in her doorway with his smooth, satisfied smile and his forged piece of paper. About everything she had built and kept and managed and maintained her entire adult life, and how all of it had been taken away by one man with access to ink and a seal, and the casual assumption that a woman alone wouldn't know what to do about it. She thought about Silas Boone's hands flat on the table, about the way he had told her she put those eggs back because it mattered to her, and the fact that he had noticed that, and the fact that noticing it had apparently been sufficient for him to offer her either employment or matrimony, with the same business-like calm he probably used to quote lumber prices. She looked at the wilting flowers in the jar on the table. She looked at the pantry cabinet, whose contents she had already assessed automatically from across the room. The gaps in the shelving, the things that were running low, the things that were running out completely. The waste she could already see in the arrangement of the stores. The money sitting uncollected on those shelves in the form of poor organization alone. She got up. She went to the pantry cabinet and opened it. She stood in front of it for several minutes, cataloging every shelf. Then she went to find a piece of paper. She was writing the supply inventory when Silas came back inside an hour later. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her sitting at the table with a candle and 2 columns of figures, and what appeared to be the beginnings of a formal stock-taking ledger, and for a moment his expression shifted, not into surprise exactly, but into something that looked like careful, quiet recognition. The expression of a man who has just discovered that the thing he thought might be useful is something considerably more important than useful. Rebecca didn't look up. Your salt pork supply will run out before the first frost if the seasonal hands arrive in September. You're also significantly overstocked on cornmeal relative to your flour, which suggests whoever's been purchasing supplies is buying on habit rather than calculation. She moved the candle slightly and continued writing. I'll need to know how many hands you're expecting and what they're typically fed. 4 hands, he said. Currently they eat what they can cook themselves, which is beans. Every day? Every day. She wrote something down. That changes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, does that mean you're choosing employment? She kept writing. It means I'm choosing to be useful while I think about it. She heard something that might have been, in a quieter man, the beginning of a laugh. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. And outside the window, the Montana night pressed against the glass, deep and black and full of pine. And somewhere in the valley the cattle moved in their slow, patient circles, and in a chicken coop beside the barn 3 eggs sat warm in their nests. And Rebecca Holloway began building, quietly, practically, with a pen and a ledger and a head full of numbers. The first foundation of what would eventually become her life. She chose work. She chose work because she was 26 years old, and she had spent her whole life watching what happened to women who allowed their circumstances to make their decisions for them, and she was not going to do that. Not even now. Not even desperate. Not even 3 eggs away from collapse. If she was going to have any future worth building, it was going to be built on ground she chose, and walked onto deliberately. Not ground she fell onto, because she had nowhere left to stand. But she lay awake in the small room at the end of the hall, the one whose lock Silas would fix the next morning, exactly as he had promised. And she listened to the mountain wind moving through the pines, and she thought about a man who had looked at her shoes before he looked at her face, and offered her options before he offered her charity. She thought about that for a long time. She was still thinking about it when she finally fell asleep. The next morning she was up before the sun. She had the stove lit and water heating, and had already begun rearranging the pantry by the time Silas came through from the yard at first light, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and took in the evidence of what she had done in the gray morning stillness. And he said nothing at all, which she was beginning to understand was his way of saying quite a lot. She handed him a cup of coffee. "You have a problem with your freight account," she said. "I looked at the invoice copies in the pantry drawer last night. You're being charged a weight rate that doesn't correspond to your actual loads. I'd need to see the original contracts to verify, but based on the invoice copies alone, you've likely overpaid somewhere in the range of $12 to $15 over the last season." He took the coffee. He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "You looked at my invoices." The drawer was open. She turned back to the stove. "I can reconstruct the correct accounting if you show me the contracts. It's straightforward work." He was quiet behind her for a long moment. Then, "Invoices are in the office, cabinet on the left." She nodded. "After breakfast." She cooked eggs, properly, in butter she found at the back of the pantry behind 3 tins of things that had been pushed there and forgotten, and bread that she cut thicker than the day-old slices he had apparently been working through, and she set a plate in front of him without ceremony, and he ate it the way a person eats something they hadn't realized they were missing. "When did you last have a proper meal?" she asked, sitting across from him with her own plate. He looked at her. "Thursday." It was Saturday. Rebecca said nothing. She filed it alongside the wilting flowers, and the half-organized pantry, and the meals of beans, and the 9 years alone in the mountain valley. And she built a quiet, careful picture of a man whose life had all the structural components of something good, and none of the warmth. She understood that. She thought perhaps he understood that she understood it. They ate without speaking, which was easy and comfortable in a way that surprised her, because silence had become something frightening to her in the weeks since her father died, a thing that pressed too hard and left too much room for grief. With Silas, it was simply silence, present and unhurried, the kind that didn't demand anything from the people inside it. When he left for the morning work, he paused at the door. "One rule in this house," he said, without turning around. "Nobody here owes affection for food or shelter. What's given here is given because it's right, not because it's owed." "Owed." Rebecca set down her fork. She looked at the back of his broad shoulders, the long black hair, the sleeveless leather vest over work-hardened arms, and she felt something shift in her chest again, the same something that had shifted the night before, and this time she did not entirely press it back down. "Understood," she said. He went out. She cleared the table. She washed the dishes. She went into the small room he called the office and opened the cabinet on the left, and she found the freight contracts, and she sat down on the floor with them spread around her and the morning light coming through the one small window, and she started reading. Because she was Rebecca Holloway, and she had a ledger and a pen and a head full of numbers and a fraudulent merchant somewhere back in Alder Creek who believed she had been defeated, and she had never once in her life allowed a problem that could be solved with arithmetic to defeat her, not once. She was not about to start now. She found the discrepancy on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after she arrived. She had been working through the freight contracts methodically, the way she worked through everything, column by column, date by date, cross-referencing the invoice copies against the original agreements. And she almost missed it because it was buried in the middle of a long, densely written contract renewal from 2 years prior. A weight classification that had been quietly altered. Not crossed out and rewritten, the way an honest correction would be made. Simply replaced. The original ink slightly lighter than the ink around it. The kind of difference you would never notice unless you were looking at paper in good morning light with the document held at an angle. She held it at an angle for a long time. Then she carried it to the kitchen table, set it flat, and wrote 3 numbers in her ledger. Silas came in from the yard at mid-morning and found her sitting very still, with both hands flat on the table, the freight contract in front of her. He read her stillness the way he read weather, by what it wasn't doing rather than what it was. "You found something," he said. "They changed the weight classification in the second year of the contract. Here." She turned the page toward him and pointed. "This is listed as a bulk dry goods rate, but the classification was originally a standard household rate. The difference is about 4 cents per hundredweight. It doesn't sound like much until you multiply it by 3 seasons of monthly deliveries." Silas looked at the paper, then at her. "How much?" $18.40, minimum." She looked up. "And that's only what I can document from the copies you have. If the original weigh slips show different numbers at point of origin, which I suspect they might, the total could be considerably more." He pulled out the chair and sat down across from her, the same way he had that first night, giving her the table as a workspace, not taking it over. She had noticed that about him. He was a large man who seemed to understand, almost by instinct, when to make himself smaller. "The freight company is based in Alder Creek," he said. "I know. Bell has an interest in it." She looked at him. "How large an interest?" "Significant. The previous owner sold his stake 3 years ago when Bell started pressing on his loans." She wrote something in her ledger. Her hand was steady. "So Bell has been overcharging you for freight, as a slow drain." "As a slow drain," Silas confirmed, "while simultaneously trying to purchase your valley. At a below-market price I've refused twice." She tapped her pen against the page. "He's doing to you what he did to the farmers. Not the same method. You're not vulnerable to a debt scheme. Your finances are solid. But the same principle. Reduce the income, increase the pressure, make the sale look more reasonable than it would otherwise be." She paused. "Has the offer price increased between the first and second time he approached you?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "No. Then he's patient." She closed the ledger. "He's very patient, Silas. That's the part that worries me." It was the first time she had used his given name. Neither of them noted it aloud, but it settled between them like something quietly agreed upon. She sent a formal letter to the freight company that afternoon, citing the specific contract clause, the altered classification, and the calculated overpayment. She wrote it in the precise, business-like language her father had taught her. No emotion, no accusation, only numbers. Numbers arranged so clearly and so irrefutably that disagreement would require the other party to explain, in writing, exactly why the numbers were wrong. She had learned from her father that the most powerful letter was the one that made the recipient understand, without being told directly, that the person who sent it knew exactly what they were looking at. 3 days later, a response arrived. Not a denial, not a legal threat. A check for $14 with a brief note citing a clerical error in rate classification. $14, not $18. She wrote back the same day asking for the remaining $4.40 and attaching a precise accounting of the discrepancy. The remaining payment arrived the following week. Silas held the second check and said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "You scared them." "I gave them an accurate accounting of what they owed," she said. "Same thing." She almost smiled. "Put it in the supply budget. We need to restock the salt before September." He did, and then September arrived. 4 ranch hands came in from the South Trail on a Thursday morning. 2 brothers named Clem and Odell Marsh, a quiet older man everyone called Hatch, who had been working seasonal cattle work since before Rebecca was born, and a young man named Davis, who was 19 years old and had the particular combination of eagerness and bad judgment that Rebecca recognized as a condition common to 19-year-old boys everywhere, in every era, in every corner of the country. They arrived at the kitchen door with the instinctive hope of men who had been eating their own cooking for 6 months on a remote cattle drive, and Rebecca met them with a pot of beef stew that had been simmering since dawn, fresh bread, and a look on her face that communicated, without a single word, that she had been managing households since she was 14 years old, and she was not going to have any trouble whatsoever managing 4 ranch hands. Clem Marsh looked at the stew, looked at the bread, looked at Rebecca, looked back at the stew. "Ma'am," he said, with the reverence of a man in the presence of something sacred. Are we eating like this every day? Every day, she said. Hatch took off his hat. He was the only one who did. She noted it. Davis, 19 and unfiltered, looked around the kitchen and then at Rebecca with an expression of visible calculation that she recognized immediately. You cook all this yourself? I do. Boone paying you a fair wage for that? Davis, Silas said from the doorway, very quietly. Davis discovered with some urgency that he was suddenly very interested in sitting down. The hands settled in. Rebecca watched them the way she watched everything, with a quiet, comprehensive attention that people often mistook for passivity until they realized she had seen everything and forgotten nothing. She noted who washed before eating and who didn't, and the relative quantities of coffee consumed by each man at each meal, and which of them had been nursing an old joint injury, and which had a cough that was going to need attention before the cold came in. She also noted something else. Within 4 days of the hands' arrival, the whole rhythm of the ranch changed. She had not anticipated this. Or rather, she had anticipated it in the abstract way you anticipate that a thing will improve, without being able to foresee exactly how. But food, she understood now more viscerally than she ever had before, was not just sustenance. It was the mechanism that held a working community together. Men who were properly fed showed up on time. They worked steadier. They complained less and communicated more. Silas's operation had been running on the structural equivalent of cold beans, functional, barely, and now it was running on something else entirely. She reorganized the feed schedule for the livestock and cross-referenced it against the pasture rotation Silas used. And she found that there was a pattern of waste in how the winter hay was distributed that cost roughly $8 a season. She presented it to Silas over supper one evening, and he looked at her figures for a long time before he said, My father did it that way. Your father may not have known what hay cost in 1884. He looked at her. I'm not criticizing your father, she said immediately. I'm saying that some methods outlive the conditions that created them. The pasture rotation still makes sense. The distribution timing doesn't anymore. Here's what would. She turned the ledger toward him. He read it carefully, and she watched his face. The slow, patient way he processed information, turning it over without hurry. She had learned in the first 2 weeks that Silas Boone made no decision quickly, and very few decisions badly, and she had come to find this one of the most genuinely reassuring things about him. All right, he said. That was all. No argument, no territorial resistance, no implication that it was unusual for a woman to be reforming the agricultural economics of his cattle operation. Just, all right. As if the idea had merit, and merit was sufficient. She found herself thinking about that, later, washing dishes in the lamplight while the hands played cards in the bunkhouse and Silas worked at something on the porch. She thought about how many men she had met in her life who would have found a reason to dismiss the same information if it came from a woman. Not because the numbers were wrong, but because the numbers needed to be wrong in order for the dynamic to remain comfortable. She thought about how exhausting that had been to navigate her whole life, and how strange and novel it was to simply not have to navigate it, to present a figure and have it evaluated on its own terms. She was still thinking about it when Silas came through the kitchen on his way to the back of the house and paused near the dry sink. There's something I need to tell you, he said. She set down the dish she was drying. His tone was careful in a way it wasn't usually careful, precise, as if he was choosing words the way she chose numbers. All right. Belle was here this afternoon while you were in the garden. She turned around fully. I didn't tell you immediately because I wanted to think through what he said before I did. He set both hands flat on the kitchen table. The same gesture she had first seen from him the night she arrived, she realized. The gesture of a man putting everything on the table and leaving nothing back. He made a third offer on the valley, lower than the second. Lower, she said, by 12%. She processed this. He's decreasing the offer, not increasing it. Yes, that's a pressure tactic, she said. He's telling you that the price will keep dropping, that waiting costs you. It only works if the other person believes he has some leverage that makes waiting genuinely costly. She looked at him carefully. Did he say anything else? Silas was quiet for a moment, that was slightly longer than his usual quiet. He mentioned you. The air in the kitchen changed. Not dramatically. The lamp still burned, the fire still breathed in the stove, but something shifted in it. What did he say? He said he understood I'd taken in a woman from town who had made some accusations against him that the court had found insufficient. His voice remained level, but she could hear something underneath it. Not anger exactly, but a kind of controlled tension, the sound of a man keeping a very firm hand on something that wanted to move faster. He said he hoped I'd considered what kind of character I was inviting onto my property. Rebecca set the dish towel down on the sink edge. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. He told the court that my father's debt was legitimate, she said. He produced documents. The court saw the documents and saw a woman without legal representation and made the obvious decision. She picked up the dish towel again. What he's calling insufficient accusations are a collection of original receipts that I have not yet finished examining. He knows that. That's why he came here. He thinks you have evidence. I think I might. She turned back to the sink. I need more time with my father's ledger. There are transaction numbers on the repayment receipts that I haven't been able to cross-reference yet because I don't have access to the records they'd reference. But if the pattern is what I think it is... She stopped. Tell me, Silas said. She turned around again. Bell didn't just forge a debt against my father. I think he's been running the same scheme against multiple landowners. I think the same transaction numbering pattern appears in more than one set of documents, which would mean there's a template, a single forged accounting system he's been using across different victims. If I can establish that the numbers don't correspond to any legitimate ledger, but do correspond to each other, then I can demonstrate that the debts were manufactured from the same source. She paused. That's not a he said she said dispute over one loan. That's documentary evidence of a pattern. Courts treat those differently. Silas looked at her for a long time. How long have you been working on this? Since my 3rd night here. She met his eyes directly. I couldn't sleep. I had my father's ledger and a candle, and the invoices from your cabinet, and nothing else to do with my mind, and patterns are. I notice them. I always have. It's just how I think. She paused. I should have told you sooner. I wasn't certain enough to say anything out loud. Are you certain enough now? I'm certain enough to be frightened. She folded the dish towel with the automatic precision of someone who needed something to do with her hands. Which means Bell should be frightened too. And I think he might already know it, which is why he's here. Neither of them slept particularly well that night. The next morning she found hoofprints in the soft ground near the north fence line. Not from the ranch horses. The shoe pattern was wrong, and the approach angle came from the Alder Creek Trail rather than from any point of origin on the property. Someone had ridden up close to the fence in the night, stopped, and ridden back. She followed the line of prints to the fence post and crouched down and looked at where they stopped. Close enough to see the house clearly in daylight. She stood up. She looked at the house from that position, the kitchen window, the front porch, the yard between. And she thought about how long a person might stand here and watch without being seen from inside. She went and found Silas at the barn. Someone was watching the property last night, she said, from the north fence, rode in from the Alder Creek direction and back. He came out of the barn without speaking and walked with her to the fence line. He crouched exactly as she had and examined the prints, then stood and looked toward the Alder Creek Trail with the still, focused expression of a man reading a situation rather than reacting to it. Hatch, he said, loud enough to carry to the barn. Hatch appeared in this barn doorway. Boss? Double the night check on the outer fence starting tonight. Clem and Odell take the south and east lines. You take the north. He paused. Don't approach anyone you find. Just mark where you see them and come to me. Hatch nodded once and disappeared back into the barn without asking a single question, which Rebecca gathered was simply how Hatch operated. She stood beside Silas at the fence line and looked toward the trail. He's checking whether I'm still here, she said. Yes. And whether I've shown you what I've found. Yes. She looked at him. We should keep him uncertain about both. Silas turned and looked at her with the particular expression she had begun to recognize as his version of being impressed. A slight change in the quality of his stillness. The way a man looks when the thing in front of him just became more interesting than he'd expected. You want to draw him out. I want to give him a reason to make a mistake. She brushed the dirt from her hands. Frightened men make mistakes when they think the threat is about to become public. If Bell believes I'm close to having something presentable to a court, he'll move faster than he's been moving. And fast people leave evidence. He'll also come at you directly if he thinks you're a threat. He already thinks I'm a threat. He came here. She met his eyes. I'd rather he show his hand clearly than keep circling the fence in the dark. Silas looked at her for a long time. You know what you're proposing is dangerous. Yes. And you're proposing it anyway. Yes. He turned back toward the barn. Then we do it carefully, he said. She understood that for the agreement it was. The following week was the week Rebecca Holloway stopped being the woman Alder Creek had dismissed and started becoming something considerably harder to dismiss. She worked on her father's ledger every evening after supper, long past the time. The hands went to the bunkhouse, and the lamp oil in the kitchen was the only light in the house except the stars. Silas often stayed at the kitchen table working on his own accounts or repairing tack, not because he needed to be there, but in the quiet, unspoken way he had of simply being present in the same space, not watching her, not asking questions, just there. She noticed. She said nothing about it, because naming it felt premature, and because it was simply comfortable, and she had stopped having access to comfort such a short time ago that she found she was almost protective of it, reluctant to examine it too directly in case the examination disturbed it. She was deep in the receipts on a Thursday evening when she found the number. Transaction reference 4471B. It appeared on a repayment receipt from her father's loan file. Standard looking. Dated 14 months before his death. She had seen it before and noted it without knowing what it connected to. But now, with Bell's freight invoice copies spread across half the table from her work on Silas's accounts, she was looking at a different document. A supply credit note from Bell's merchant store to a farmer named Garrett Pullen, whose land Bell had acquired 2 years ago, and she saw it again. Transaction reference 4471B. The same number, different document, different transaction, different person, different date, 6 months prior to the one in her father's file. A reference number that appeared in both places should correspond to a single, specific transaction in Bell's ledger. It couldn't, by any legitimate accounting system, appear in 2 separate loan files involving 2 separate people as a reference to 2 different events. Either someone had used the same reference number twice by clerical error, possible in a sloppy operation, or the numbers were not references to real transactions at all. They were placeholders. Invented figures applied to fabricated entries to give them the appearance of a legitimate paper trail. She sat very still. Then she got up and went to the back room where she had been keeping her father's ledger in the inside pocket of her coat, and she brought it to the table, and she went through every receipt, every entry, every margin notation, and she wrote down every reference number she found. 17 numbers. She laid them out in the order they appeared in her father's file, and then cross-referenced each one against the Bell documents she had. The invoice copies, the supply credit note, 2 other papers she had found in her father's papers that she hadn't fully understood until now. And the pattern was there. Unmistakable. 4 of the 17 numbers appeared across multiple documents, referencing different people and different alleged transactions. Always in the same handwriting, always in the same ink weight, not clerical error. A template. Bell had a template for fraudulent loan documentation, and he had reused it so many times across so many victims that the numbers had started to overlap. She heard Silas set down his leather punch on the table. Rebecca. She looked up. He was looking at her face. You found it. She pressed both hands flat on the table. Her voice was steady, which surprised her slightly, because underneath the steadiness, her whole body was vibrating with something between fury and something she didn't have a word for. The particular sensation of seeing a truth that has been hidden from you finally become visible on the page in front of you, like watching a photograph develop in a darkroom. Clear. Irrefutable. Yours. I found it, she said. And it isn't just my father. Transaction reference 4471B is in Garrett Pullen's credit note and in my father's repayment receipt. That same reference appears in a Bell document from a land transaction I found in the county recorder filings 2 years ago. I copied it by hand when I was in town before I left, because something about the numbers bothered me, and I didn't understand why yet. She turned the ledger toward him. I understand now. This number should correspond to one transaction. It's in 4 different documents involving 4 different people. That is not a mistake. Silas looked at the ledger. He looked at it for a long time. The careful, methodical attention of a man who needed to understand something fully before he decided what to do about it. That's enough for a territorial court, he said. It's enough to open a real investigation, she corrected. Which is different from a court decision, but it's the start of one. If an investigator subpoenas Bell's ledgers and finds that reference 4471B doesn't correspond to any real entry, or corresponds to one that was clearly altered, then everything built on that reference collapses. She looked up. Including the debt against my father's farm. Silas was quiet. How soon can you have it written up formally? 2 days. I want to be thorough. She paused. I also want copies in 2 separate locations before we take the original anywhere. He nodded. Who do we take it to? Not the county sheriff. Bell has the county sheriff. She had been thinking about this. The territorial marshal's office in Helena. They operate independently of county structures, and a fraud case of this scale, spanning multiple properties across a 3-year period, is within their jurisdiction. I need someone to carry a letter there directly. Not post. Direct delivery. Hatch, Silas said immediately. He's the most reliable man I have, and he doesn't talk. Ask him tomorrow. Silas stood up from the table. He collected his tools and put them in their places with the quiet, automatic efficiency that characterized everything he did. And then he paused beside the table and looked at her. Not at the documents, not at the ledger, but at her face, with the same steady, uncalculated directness that had unnerved her the first night, and had somehow, over the weeks since, become one of the things she most valued about him. You've been carrying all of this since the night you arrived, he said. I didn't know what I had yet. But you knew you had something. I knew something was wrong, she said. There's a difference. She looked down at the documents. My father knew something was wrong too. He just couldn't prove it fast enough. The words sat between them with the particular weight of things said that cannot be taken back, and that don't need to be, because they are simply true. Silas put on his coat. He reached the kitchen door and stopped. Rebecca. He didn't turn around. He's going to find out you're getting close. However careful we are, he'll find out. I know. When he does, he's going to come here. I know. He turned then, just slightly, not quite looking back, the profile of a man standing at the edge of a decision he had already made, but was choosing the words for carefully. When that happens, he said, I need you to understand that I will stand with you, not in front of you, with you. Whatever you need me to do and nothing you don't. That's my word. Rebecca Holloway looked at a man who had fixed a lock he promised to fix, who had left flowers he insisted grew too close to the trail, who had sat across a kitchen table for weeks in the lamplight simply being present, and who had just articulated, in fewer than 30 words, a more precise understanding of what she needed than most people managed in a lifetime. I know, she said again. This time it meant something different. He went out. She turned back to the table and picked up her pen and began writing the formal summary that would eventually make its way to the territorial marshal's office in Helena. And outside the window, the Montana night was immense and dark and cold, and somewhere on the Alder Creek Trail, a man who had stolen her father's farm was beginning to understand that the frightened woman he had dismissed on the porch with a piece of paper and a smooth smile was considerably more dangerous than he had accounted for. She wrote until midnight. Then she banked the stove, covered the documents, and went to bed. And for the first time in 11 weeks, she slept without dreaming about her father's grave. Hatch left for Helena before sunrise. Rebecca had given him 2 envelopes. One sealed with wax, containing the formal summary for the Territorial Marshal's office, and one unsealed containing a copy of the transaction reference analysis, written in plain language clear enough that any literate person could follow the logic without legal training. She had spent the previous 2 days writing both versions, checking every figure 3 times, cross-referencing every number against its source document until she was certain there was not a single error anywhere in either letter. One mistake would give Belle's lawyers a foothold. She wasn't going to give them one. Hatch took the envelopes without reading them and tucked them inside his coat with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that what he was carrying mattered without needing to know exactly why. He looked at Rebecca once before he mounted up, a long, steady look that had in it something she recognized. The look of a person who has been around long enough to know when something important is happening and wants to mark the moment. "Ride careful," she said. "Always do, ma'am," he said, and he was gone before the sky turned fully light. Silas stood beside her in the yard and watched the trail long after the sound of hoofbeats faded into the pines. 3 days to Helena, he said. 3 back. And then however long the marshal's office takes to respond. She crossed her arms against the morning cold. Belle won't wait that long if he finds out the letters have been sent. He's going to find out. I know. She turned toward the house. Then we make sure we're ready before he does. Being ready, as it turned out, meant something different to Rebecca than it meant to most people. It did not mean acquiring firearms, or strengthening locks, or preparing for a physical confrontation, though those things were not irrelevant. It meant documentation. More documentation, better documentation, arranged so that even if Belle arrived with a dozen armed men and a legal order to seize every paper on the property, the information could not be completely destroyed because it already existed in multiple places, in multiple forms, in the hands of multiple people who had no reason to protect Horace Bell. She made 3 additional copies of the transaction reference analysis. She sent one to a lawyer in Billings, whose name she had found in an old newspaper advertisement. A man who had no connection to Alder Creek or to any of Bell's interests, as far as she could determine. She sent another copy to the Billings Gazette with a letter identifying it only as documentation relevant to an ongoing investigation, requesting they hold it pending any inquiry from territorial authorities. The 3rd copy she gave to Silas to keep in a separate location from the ranch house. She did not tell him where she kept the originals. "You don't trust me with the location," he said. It was not an accusation. He said it the way he said most things. Observationally, with an undertone of respect rather than injury. "I trust you completely," she said. "I don't trust that you can keep information from showing on your face if Belle pushes hard enough in the wrong direction. You're an honest man. That makes you a poor liar." She met his eyes directly. "Separation protects us both. If you don't know, you can't be pressured into revealing it." He looked at her for a moment. Most people would be offended by being told they're a poor liar. "I'm not most people." "No," he said quietly, "you are not." The night of the 9th day after Hatch's departure, Davis came in from the north fence at a dead run. Rebecca heard the boots on the porch before the door opened, and she was already putting down her pen when Davis came through the kitchen door breathing hard, his young face pale beneath the trail dust. He pulled his hat off and looked at her. "Ma'am, someone's on the road, more than one, coming from the Alder Creek direction, and they're riding fast." She stood up. "How far?" 20 minutes, maybe less." She turned to the documents on the table. She had known this moment was coming, had constructed the entire document strategy around the certainty of it. But the body had its own response to knowing, and the body's response was not calm. Her hands moved quickly and steadily anyway, because she had learned a long time ago that emotion and function were not mutually exclusive if you had practiced being functional under pressure. She gathered the originals. She went to the place she had prepared 3 weeks ago, a location she had chosen for its complete invisibility from any position outside the house, and she secured the documents. She came back to the kitchen. Silas was already in the doorway, having come in from the barn when Davis ran past. He looked at her face. "They're coming." "Yes." "The documents?" "Handled." He nodded once. Clem, Odell. He raised his voice toward the bunkhouse. Get up and get dressed. We have company coming. He looked at Davis. Go wake Hatch's replacement and tell him to stay at the barn. Don't come out unless I call. Hatch isn't back yet, Davis said. I know, which is why I need you not to be visible. Silas looked at him steadily. Davis, are you hearing me? Davis heard him. He went. Rebecca untied her apron and folded it over the back of the chair with a deliberateness that surprised her. She hadn't made a conscious decision to do it, but the gesture felt right, felt like closing one chapter before the next one began. She smoothed her dress. She looked at Silas. I want to be on the porch when they arrive, she said. He looked at her. Not inside, she said. Not behind you. On the porch. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped aside from the doorway. After you, he said. They came out of the dark, like something premeditated, which they were. 4 riders and a wagon, the wagon carrying 2 additional men, and the man at the center of the lead group was Horace Bell, riding with the upright confidence of a man who had never once in his professional life arrived somewhere and been turned away. Beside him rode a man Rebecca recognized from town, Walt Greer, who wore a deputy's badge and owed Bell 3 months of back wages on a personal loan. Bell had extended him 2 years ago. She had known about that loan. She had documented it. She had not yet had an opportunity to use it. Tonight was apparently the night. Bell pulled up in the yard and looked at the porch and whatever he had expected to find there, a frightened woman, a confrontation that could be managed, was clearly not what he found, because something shifted briefly in his expression before the professional smoothness came back over it like a curtain drawn. Boone, he said. He didn't look at Rebecca when he said it. He was performing for an audience of himself, and in his version of this scene, she was not the primary character. I apologize for the late hour. I have a matter of some urgency regarding property on your land. My land is in order, Silas said. His voice was exactly as it always was. Level, unhurried. The voice of a man who was not performing anything. I'm afraid there's been a theft of business documents, Bell said. I have reason to believe those documents are currently on this property. Now he looked at Rebecca. The look was measured, deliberate, meant to diminish. Miss Holloway removed certain records from my merchant office before she left Alder Creek. I'd like them returned. Rebecca heard the lie and noted it with the same clean precision she applied to everything. She had never been inside Bell's merchant office in her life. I took nothing from your office, she said. Her voice was level. I have never been in your office. I left Alder Creek with my father's personal ledger and 3 dresses. You're welcome to search the bag they came in. Bell's mouth thinned slightly. The documents in question pertain to your father's loan account. They are the property of the Bell Merchant and Land Trust. My father's repayment receipts are not the property of the Bell Merchant and Land Trust, she said. They are records of transactions completed by my father, signed by his own hand, and they belong to the Holloway family estate, which is me. Those receipts contain proprietary accounting information. Those receipts contain transaction reference numbers, she said, and the quality of the silence that followed was its own kind of climax, because Bell's expression did not change, and the fact that it did not change told her everything she needed to know about how much he understood of what she had just said. He knew exactly what the transaction reference numbers meant. He had known this was coming. Greer moved his horse forward slightly. Miss Holloway, I'm going to have to ask you to produce any documents in your possession related to Bell Merchant accounts. Failure to comply could result in... Walt, Silas said. Greer stopped. Silas hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved from where he stood on the porch. He had simply said the man's name and the weight in it. The quiet, complete, absolute weight of a man who owned this land and every foot of ground between his boots and the fence line was sufficient. Walt, Silas said again, in the same register. How much do you owe Bell on that personal loan? The yard went very quiet. Greer's face changed. He looked at Silas, and then he looked at Rebecca, and she could see him working through the implications. That she knew about the loan, that she had documentation of it, that the question had been asked in front of witnesses. That's not relevant to, he started. It's relevant to whether your badge has any independent authority in this situation, or whether you're here as a creditor's agent, Rebecca said quietly. Which is a different legal standing entirely. Belle's horse shifted under him. He steadied it with a tight hand. She stole from you, Boone. His voice had a new edge in it now. Not anger exactly, but the particular sound of a man recalibrating. She stole eggs from your property her first night here. She's a thief. You took in a thief, and now she's using your hospitality to... Silas stepped forward. One step. I didn't reach for anything. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped to the edge of the porch and stood there. And the full physical reality of him, the height, the breadth of shoulder, the weathered, unmovable stillness, arrived in the yard like a change in the weather. You made your mistake, Silas said, when you decided she needed me to speak for her. Belle blinked. Rebecca came down one step from the porch, then another. She came down until she was standing in the yard with Belle's riders on three sides of her, and she stood straight in her dress with her hands at her sides and her voice perfectly, deliberately level. I don't, she said. She reached into her dress pocket and produced a document. Not the originals. Those were secured. This was a copy. A clean, careful copy in her own hand of the transaction reference analysis, and she held it with both hands so the riders on either side of her could see it clearly. Transaction reference 4471B, she said, loudly and clearly enough that every man in the yard could hear her. Appears in my father's repayment receipt, dated March 1882, in Garrett Pullen's supply credit note, dated September 1881, in the land transfer documentation for the Hendricks property, dated June 1883, and in two additional Belle merchant documents that I have independently verified, and copies of which are currently in the possession of the Territorial Marshal's office in Helena, a law office in Billings, and the Billings Gazette. She looked directly at Belle. One reference number cannot legitimately appear in four separate financial instruments involving four separate parties, which means those instruments were fabricated from a common template, which means the debts they record are fraudulent. She stopped. Let it land. A sound came from the road. Not from Belle's party. From the Alder Creek direction. From the road that ran past the ranch property along the valley toward the settlement. Horses. A wagon. More than one. And then a lantern appearing at the fence, and then another, and then a man's voice calling out. That you, Boone? In the voice of someone who had come some distance specifically to ask. It was Thomas Garrett. Rebecca knew him, had seen him twice in Alder Creek before she left. He ran the valley's small blacksmith operation and had lost his eastern pasture to a Belle debt claim 18 months ago. Beside him rode Rebecca didn't recognize, and behind them another wagon with two men she had seen in town. More lanterns. More voices on the road. She had not arranged this. She had not communicated with any of these people in the weeks since Hatch left for Helena. But she had sent letters. Careful, factual letters in the same plain language as the Marshal's office copy. To the Billings Gazette, and news in Frontier, Montana, traveled in ways that did not require a newspaper to be printed. It traveled the way everything on the frontier traveled, person to person, along trail routes, carried by the same wagon traffic that carried mail and goods and word of trouble and word of hope. Someone had talked. Thomas Garrett pulled up at the fence and looked across the yard at Belle with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment for a long time and has just recognized it. Evening, Belle, he said. Heard there was a conversation happening tonight worth attending. Belle looked at the fence. His jaw tightened. The woman in the wagon beside Garrett called out, My name is Clara Hendricks. My husband's land is in your list, Miss Holloway. Her voice was steady and clear. I'd like to hear what you found. Then a second voice from the back wagon. Jim Paulson. Belle claimed a supply debt against me 2 years ago. I got papers that didn't look right at the time and I kept them. Didn't know what to do with them. He held up a folded document. Maybe I know now. Rebecca looked at Jim Paulson. She looked at Clara Hendricks. She looked at Thomas Garrett. And then she looked back at Horace Bell, whose hired riders were very still on their horses, and whose deputy was no longer looking at Rebecca at all, but was looking at the growing assembly at the fence with the careful expression of a man deciding which way the wind was blowing. "You have no legal standing here," Bell said. His voice was still controlled, but only just, the way water is controlled by a dam whose base is beginning to move. "This is a private property matter, and these people have no—" "They have names in my ledger," Rebecca said, "and I'll read every one of them aloud right now if you'd like." She looked at the crowd at the fence. She raised her voice. "How many of you received a debt notice from the Bell Merchant and Land Trust in the last 4 years?" Hands. 3, and then 4, and then a fifth from somewhere farther back. Bell made a decision. The wrong one. He swung down from his horse and moved toward the porch with a deliberateness that made the whole yard tighten at once. Toward Rebecca. Toward the copy she was holding. Reaching for it with the flat certainty of a man who had always been able to simply take what he needed because he had always arrived with enough authority to take it. Silas caught his wrist. Not violently. Not with a strike or a throw. He simply closed one large hand around Bell's wrist 2 feet before it reached Rebecca and stopped him. Completely. The way a wall stops a man. Bell pulled. Silas held. "No," Silas said. Bell looked up at him. Something moved in his face that Rebecca had never seen there before. Something that might, in a lesser man, have been fear. "You are standing on my land," Silas said, in the same level voice he used for everything, which was somehow more imposing than anger would have been. "And you are reaching for something that belongs to her. And you are going to take your hand back now." He released Bell's wrist. Bell stepped back. Rebecca turned to face the fence and raised the copy of the transaction reference analysis, so the lantern light caught it. "Transaction reference 4471B, she said again, for everyone at the fence to hear. "I can explain exactly what this number means and what it proves, and I will. To every one of you who wants to understand what happened to your land and your families and your father's farms." She looked at Bell over her shoulder. "And to the Territorial Marshal's office in Helena, which received this documentation 6 days ago." Bell's deputy, Walt Greer, walked his horse sideways 2 steps toward the gate. One of Bell's hired riders turned his horse in a small, careful circle, a gesture with no stated purpose except that it faced him toward the road. Bell stood in the yard and looked at the faces at the fence. Thomas Garrett and Clara Hendricks and Jim Paulson and the hands full of raised arms. And Rebecca watched him understand, in real time, that this was no longer the scene he had arrived to manage. He had arrived to intimidate one woman in the dark at a remote mountain property. What he found instead was a community that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting. Waiting for someone to name what they had all separately suspected, to lay the numbers on the table with enough clarity and enough copies in enough separate locations that destroying the evidence was no longer a manageable option. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Rebecca agreed. "It isn't. The Territorial Marshal will finish it." She kept her voice even, completely, deliberately even. "But this part, where you come to my door in the dark and tell me the documents I carry are stolen, and wave a deputy's badge that you paid for with a loan the deputy can't repay. This part is finished." Bell said nothing. His face had the closed, calculating look of a man not retreating, but relocating, regrouping, reframing, finding a different angle. She knew that look. She had seen it the morning he stood in her father's doorway with a forged piece of paper and a smooth smile. He was not done. He would not be done until the marshal's office made him done. But he was done tonight. He mounted his horse. His riders followed. Greer went without looking at anyone. The wagon turned on the road, and then Bell paused. Just for a moment, just long enough to look back at Rebecca standing in the yard with the lantern light from the fence catching her face. And something crossed his expression that she filed away carefully and completely, because it was going to matter later. It was not anger. It was not humiliation. It was the expression of a man making a new calculation, deciding on a new approach, filing a new category for the obstacle in front of him. He was reclassifying her. She had gone from nuisance to threat. She understood what that meant. Silas came to stand beside her in the yard as the sound of hoofbeats faded down the road toward Alder Creek. Not in front of her. Beside her. close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cooling night air, the solid, unhurried presence of a man who had stood exactly where she needed him to stand. Thomas Garrett came through the gate. "Miss Holloway." He pulled his hat off and held it in both hands with the careful respect of a man who has something difficult to say and isn't sure how to say it. "I lost that pasture a year and a half ago. Couldn't make sense of the numbers then. My wife cried for a week." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." "You think this marshal is going to do something?" "I think the documentation is sufficient to compel an investigation. That's the first step." She looked at him. "An investigation can subpoena Bell's original ledgers. If those ledgers show what I believe they'll show, the debts can be invalidated. And the land—" She paused. "I'm not a lawyer, Mr. Garrett, but I believe there's a path back to the land for some of you. I want to be careful about promising what I can't guarantee." He nodded. He put his hat back on. "You said the marshal got the documentation 6 days ago." 6 days. Then we wait." "Then we wait," she said. "And we stay visible. He works better when people aren't watching. Make sure people are watching." Garrett almost smiled. He went back to his wagon. Rebecca stood in the yard until all the lanterns along the fence had retreated back to the road, until the last wagon had gone, until the night was quiet again, with only the wind in the pines and the sound of cattle somewhere far down the valley. She was aware of Silas standing a few feet behind her, not speaking, not pressing. She thought about Bell's face as he rode away, the new calculation in it, the reclassification. She thought about how much harder the next phase would be, and then Clem Marsh appeared from the direction of the barn, moving fast, holding something in his hand. He crossed the yard and came to her directly, which was out of character for Clem, who had a habitual deference that meant he usually went to Silas first. "Miss Holloway." He was out of breath. "I found this, tucked under the north barn door. Must have been left while everybody was in the yard." He held out a folded piece of paper. She took it and unfolded it. 3 lines of writing in an unfamiliar hand, no signature, short, precise. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Silas. "He has a witness," she said. "Someone willing to testify that my father signed a promissory note for the full amount Bell claimed. A witness who apparently worked at the freight office." She folded the paper carefully. "If that testimony is accepted, it complicates the transaction reference analysis. It doesn't disprove it, but it introduces a competing account, and courts weigh testimony against documents differently depending on who presents them." "Who left the note?" Silas said. "I don't know." She looked at the paper. "Someone who knew about the witness and wanted me to know too." She paused. "Someone on Bell's side who isn't entirely on Bell's side." "Or someone setting a trap," Silas said. "Yes." She folded the paper again and tucked it into her pocket. "Either way, I need to know who that witness is before the marshal's investigator arrives in Alder Creek and interviews him. Because if I know who he is, I know what he can and cannot credibly claim to have seen." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "Rebecca." "I'm not going to do anything reckless," she said. "I just need to think." "That's what I'm afraid of," he said. But there was no real fear in it. There was something else, the particular tone of a man who has realized, somewhere over the course of the past weeks, that the woman he is watching is operating several steps ahead of the terrain around her, and that his primary job is not to protect her from her own decisions, but to make sure she has whatever she needs to execute them. She looked up at him. "Trust me." "I do," he said, without hesitation, without qualification. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and the anonymous note beside her ledger and her father's account book open in front of her. And she began doing what she always did when the problem seemed largest. She broke it into its component numbers, its component names, its component dates, and she began working through them one by one with the same patient, methodical attention that had served her in the chicken coop inventory and the freight contract and the transaction reference analysis. Because every problem that could be stated clearly could be addressed clearly, and she was not going to let Horace Bell have her father's name. Not his name, not his land, not the record of his honesty. She was not going to let that happen. She picked up her pen. She wrote until the lamp oil ran low, and the first gray edge of dawn appeared at the window. And somewhere on the Helena Road, Hatch was writing back with whatever the territorial marshal's office had to say. And the answer to that question, Rebecca understood with the cold, clear certainty of someone who has laid everything on a table and must now wait to see what the table can hold, was going to determine what happened to all of them. She blew out the lamp. She sat in the dark for a moment. Then she got up and started the fire and put the coffee on, and waited for morning the way her father had always told her to wait for hard things. Not with fear, and not with false certainty, but with your hands busy and your mind clear, and your door open for whatever came next. Hatch came back on a Wednesday. Rebecca heard the horse before she saw him. She had developed that alertness over the past 10 days, a constant low-level awareness of sounds from the road that she recognized as exhausting and could not stop. She was at the kitchen when the hoofbeats came up the valley trail, and she had her hand flat on her ledger and her eyes at the window before she consciously decided to look. Hatch was alone. He was riding fast for a man his age. He had the look of someone who had not slept well in several days, and had decided that arriving was more important than arriving rested. She was at the door before he dismounted. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope, slightly worn at the edges from travel, and he held it out to her with the directness of a man delivering something he understood mattered. "Marshal's office sent a reply," he said. "And ma'am, there's a deputy marshal on his way. Name of Aldous Crane. He left Helena 2 days ahead of me. Took a different route." Rebecca looked at the envelope. "He's already en route. Supposed to arrive in Alder Creek tomorrow or the day after. He'll make contact through the Alder Creek post office." Hatch paused. "He also asked me to tell you, and I'm quoting him directly, ma'am, because he was particular about the words. He said, 'Tell Miss Holloway the documentation she sent is the most organized fraud analysis this office has received from a private citizen in 11 years of operation.'" She stood very still. "He said 11 years, Hatch confirmed, reading her expression. She opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages in a precise official hand, outlining the marshal's office's preliminary assessment of the transaction reference analysis, confirming that the pattern she had identified constituted sufficient grounds for a formal investigation under territorial fraud statutes, and advising her to secure all original documents and make herself available for interview upon Deputy Marshal Crane's arrival. It also contained one sentence near the bottom of the second page that she read 3 times before she put the letter down. It said, "We have identified 2 additional reference numbers in the pattern you documented that appear in territorial land registry filings from 1880 and 1881, predating the earliest document in your submission, which suggests the scheme may have an origin point and scope considerably larger than the incidents you have outlined." She sat down. She hadn't meant to. Her legs simply made the decision before her mind caught up. Silas came in from the yard and looked at her sitting at the table with the letter open in front of her and Hatch standing in the doorway with his hat off. He read the room in 1 second. "Good or bad?" he said. "Larger," she said. "The marshal's office found earlier instances. Bell has been doing this longer than I knew. Longer than my father. This goes back to 1880 at least." Silas pulled out a chair and sat down. "How much larger? I don't know yet." She smoothed the letter against the table. "But a deputy marshal is already on his way. He'll be in Alder Creek tomorrow or the following day." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Hatch said from the doorway, very quietly, "You done it, ma'am." She looked up at him. "We haven't done anything yet. This is the beginning of an investigation, not the end of one." "Yes, ma'am," Hatch said. "But somebody had to begin it." He went to the bunkhouse. Rebecca sat with the letter and thought about Deputy Marshal Aldous Crane riding toward Alder Creek on a different route than Hatch had taken, which meant Bell might not know he was coming, which was either a significant advantage or the kind of detail that meant nothing once the whole apparatus of a formal investigation arrived in town and became impossible to conceal. She thought about the anonymous note tucked inside the back cover of her father's ledger, the one Clem had found under the barn door, the one that told her Bell had a witness. She had spent the last 10 days trying to identify who that witness was, and had come to a conclusion she wasn't entirely comfortable with, but was almost certain was correct. The freight office. The note had said someone willing to testify who apparently worked at the freight office. The freight office where the weight classifications had been altered on Silas's contracts. A man named Cotter, who had countersigned every delivery receipt for the past 3 years. She didn't know Cotter. She didn't know what Bell had on him, or what Bell had promised him. But a man who had been signing fraudulent delivery receipts for 3 years had enough exposure of his own that Bell could apply pressure in either direction. Use him as a witness, or use the receipts as leverage to keep him quiet, depending on which was more useful at a given moment. She needed to know which direction Bell had chosen before Crane arrived. She picked up her pen and wrote a letter. Not to Crane. She would speak to Crane in person. This letter was to the Billings Gazette, and it was a follow-up to the documentation she had sent them weeks earlier. It was careful and factual, and it named the investigation without speculating about its outcome. And it contained one specific piece of information she had been holding back. The 1880 and 1881 reference numbers the marshal's office had identified, which connected the fraud to a period before most of the affected families had even arrived in the valley. She was not leaking information. She was creating a record, a published, dated record, of the timeline, so that any subsequent attempt to alter documents or suppress evidence would have to contend with a publicly established chronology. She finished the letter, sealed it, and left it on the table for the Morning Post writer. Then she went to bed and slept 6 hours, which was the most she had slept at one time in 2 weeks. The following morning she went into Alder Creek. She had not been back to town since the day she left. She was aware, walking into it now on the wagon bench beside Silas, who had not asked whether she wanted company, but had simply appeared at the wagon at the time she mentioned she was leaving, that the town looked smaller than her memory of it. Or perhaps she was just larger. She could not entirely determine which. People on the main street saw her, and the reactions were various. A woman outside the dry goods store looked at her, and then looked away with the deliberate unseeing of someone choosing not to acknowledge a thing. 2 men in front of the feed store watched the wagon pass, with the still, calculating attention of people who had not yet decided which way something was going. And at the far end of the street, a girl of perhaps 12 came running from the direction of the Garrett smithy, and stopped at the edge of the road and looked up at Rebecca with an expression of open, uncalculated curiosity. "Are you the lady from the mountain?" the girl said. "I am," Rebecca said. "Papa says you found the papers that prove what Bell did to our pasture." "I found some papers," Rebecca said. "A marshal is going to help sort out what they mean." The girl looked at her steadily. "Mama cried when we lost that pasture. She grew up on land like that." "I know," Rebecca said. "I'm going to do everything I can." The girl nodded, apparently satisfied, and ran back toward the smithy. Rebecca watched her go and felt something move through her chest that was too complicated to name. Grief and determination and something else, something forward-looking, the feeling of a person who has stopped running from something and started running toward something else entirely. Silas said nothing. He pulled the wagon up in front of the post office. She went in and posted her letter. She was coming back out when she nearly walked directly into Horace Bell. He was coming out of the land registry office next door, which shared a covered walkway with the post office. He stopped. She stopped. They were 4 feet apart on a public walkway in the middle of Alder Creek, and there was nowhere for either of them to redirect. Bell recovered first. He always recovered first. That was one of the things that made him effective, that fast recalibration, that immediate return to smoothness. "Miss Holloway," he said. Pleasant, professional. The voice of a man who had never done anything to anyone. "I didn't realize you were back in town." "I'm not back," she said. "I'm visiting. How are you finding the Boone property?" The question was conversational. It was designed to be conversational, designed to sound like small talk while communicating, clearly and deliberately, that he knew exactly where she had been and what she had been doing. "I understand you've been quite useful up there." "I've been working," she said. "Of course." He tilted his head slightly. "I wonder if you might have had a chance to reconsider the situation with your father's estate." "I've been thinking about it, and I believe there may be room to discuss a more comfortable resolution, given everything." She looked at him. What kind of resolution? He spread his hands in the gesture of a reasonable man. A small settlement. Compensation for the inconvenience of the transition. In exchange for a formal withdrawal of any complaints or allegations made to outside authorities. He was offering her money to drop the investigation. He was offering her money on a public walkway, in the middle of a town where at least 4 people within sight of them had documented grievances against him. She understood immediately that this meant one of 2 things. Either he did not yet know about Deputy Marshal Crane, or he knew and had decided that the witness, Cotter, probably Cotter, gave him enough confidence to attempt a settlement before the investigation formally opened. Either way, the offer told her something important. It told her he was scared. Scared men made offers. Confident men made demands. She had told Silas exactly that, weeks ago. I appreciate the thought, she said pleasantly, but I don't think a settlement is the right path forward. She paused. I think transparency is the right path forward. Complete transparency. For everyone. Something moved behind his eyes. Miss Holloway. I hope you have a pleasant afternoon, Mr. Bell. She walked past him. She heard him behind her, very quietly. You're making a mistake. She kept walking. Silas was on the wagon bench. He had watched the entire exchange from 30 feet away with the stillness of a mountain watching weather. He said nothing as she climbed up. He waited until they had turned off the main street before he asked. He made an offer? Settlement, in exchange for withdrawing the complaint. He's frightened. Yes. She held the reins loosely in her lap. He also has a witness he believes in. Otherwise, he'd be running, not negotiating. She paused. We need to find Cotter before Crane does. Not to interfere, to know what we're dealing with. Silas looked at the road. Cotter hasn't worked at the freight office for 6 months. He left suddenly in the spring. Nobody knows where he went. She looked at him. You already knew about Cotter. I knew he left. I didn't know why until your note. He kept his eyes on the road. There's a man named Pryor who runs a way station about 4 miles up the South Pass. Cotter's sister married Pryor's cousin. It's a loose connection, but... It's a connection, she said. It's a connection, he agreed. She thought for a moment. If Bell can produce Cotter as a witness, claiming my father signed the full promissory note, and if Cotter can be made to appear credible, that creates a factual dispute about the underlying loan. The transaction reference analysis proves the accounting pattern is fraudulent, but it doesn't by itself prove that a specific loan was not agreed to. A court could find the accounting irregular while still accepting that the debt existed in some form. That gives Bell a survivable outcome. But if Cotter's testimony can be impeached, there's nothing left. She looked at the valley opening up ahead of them, the familiar line of the mountain ridge, the pines. Cotter has been signing fraudulent freight documents for 3 years. If the marshal's investigation reaches those documents before Bell can isolate them, Cotter has every reason to tell the truth rather than face his own fraud charges. Bell knows that. Bell is racing to get Cotter's testimony on record before Crane can get to him. Silas turned the wagon toward the South Pass Road. She looked at him. Pryor's Way Station, he said simply. They found Cotter in a back room of Pryor's Way Station, sitting at a small table with a cup of cold coffee and the look of a man who had been waiting for something specific and was not particularly surprised when it arrived. He was younger than Rebecca had expected from the freight signatures, perhaps 30, with the thin, nervous quality of someone who had been making small accommodations to an impossible situation for long enough that the accommodations had become the situation. He looked at Rebecca when she came through the door, and then he looked at Silas in the doorway behind her, and then he looked at his cup. I wondered when someone would come, he said. Rebecca sat down across from him without being invited. How long have you been here? Since March. Bell told me to leave town and wait. Said he'd send word when he needed me. He turned this cup in his hands. Told me what to say. Gave me a letter to memorize. A description of Samuel Holloway. Signing documents. Specific date. Specific location. Specific amount. Did you witness Samuel Holloway sign anything? Cotter looked at her. His eyes were tired and honest in the way of people who have been dishonest for too long. "No, ma'am. I was present in the freight office the day a payment was made against the Holloway account. A full payment. I saw the receipt stamped and filed. I countersigned the transaction log." He paused. 3 weeks later, Belle came in, and the transaction log for that month was gone. New log in its place. Different entries. The room was completely quiet. "You saw my father make the full payment," Rebecca said. "Yes, ma'am." "And you've been sitting in this way station for 6 months, waiting for Belle to tell you to say the opposite." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. "Mr. Cotter." She kept her voice even. "A deputy marshal named Aldous Crane is arriving in Alder Creek today or tomorrow. He is investigating Horace Bell for fraud across multiple properties and multiple years. The fraudulent transaction logs from the freight office are part of that investigation. Your signature is on those logs." His face changed. "You have a choice," she said. "You can wait for Bell to send word, deliver the testimony he prepared for you, and when the investigation reaches the freight records, which it will, because I have documented the reference number pattern across those records, and the marshal's office has independently corroborated it, your signature will appear on fraudulent documents, and you will be accountable for whatever the court determines your participation to have been." She paused. "Or you can speak to Deputy Marshal Crane yourself, voluntarily, before he reaches you, and provide a truthful account of what you witnessed, including what you saw my father pay, and when, and the amount, and what happened to the transaction log afterward." Cotter looked at his cup for a long time. Then he looked up. "If I go to the marshal, Bell will know it was me." "Bell is going to know regardless," Rebecca said. "The question is whether you are a voluntary witness or a reluctant one, and that distinction matters significantly to how a court reads your account. He'll come after me. He's about to be under federal investigation for multi-property fraud spanning at minimum 6 years. He's going to have considerably more pressing concerns than one freight office employee." She looked at him steadily. "I am not going to tell you there is no risk. There is risk. But it is a different category of risk than the one you're currently carrying." Cotter set down the cup. He looked at Silas in the doorway, the enormous, silent, absolutely steady presence of him. And then he looked back at Rebecca. "How do I find this marshal?" "Alder Creek Post Office," she said. "He'll make contact there. Use your full name and tell the postmaster you have information for Deputy Marshal Crane on the Bell matter. He'll find you within the hour." Cotter stood up. He reached for his coat. He moved the way people move when they have made a decision they are not happy about but have determined is the only one they can actually live with. "Miss Holloway," he said, pausing. "Your father, he was a decent man. He came in to make that payment, and he thanked me by name for processing it correctly. Thanked me." His voice was level, but the effort of keeping it level was visible. "I've thought about that a great many times since March." She said nothing. Her throat had done something she was managing carefully. Cotter put on his coat and walked out. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and the valley was golden with the particular September light that made everything look simultaneously beautiful and temporary. The kind of light that reminds you autumn is a fact and not a preference. Rebecca sat on the wagon bench with her hands in her lap and said nothing for a long time. Silas let her be quiet. That was something she had come to value so specifically and so deeply that she was not sure she could have articulated it to anyone who hadn't experienced its absence. The particular quality of a person who could be present with you in silence, without filling it, without requiring the silence to produce something, without making you feel that your quiet was an inconvenience. "He thanked him," she said finally. "My father thanked a man for doing his job correctly." "That sounds like something your father would do," Silas said, which was a remarkable thing to say, given that he had never met Samuel Holloway, and she looked at him. "From what you've told me," he added. She looked at the road. "He was like that. He believed that basic courtesy that it was a practice. Something you maintained deliberately because the world would let you stop if you allowed it." She paused. "He used to say that the only thing a man could give freely without it costing him was his manners and his word, and that a man who gave those up had given up the most valuable things he owned." He raised you, Silas said. He raised me. Then he didn't give those things up. She pressed her lips together briefly, nodded once. Let the quiet come back. They were a mile from the ranch when they saw the smoke. Not from the house chimney, correctly. But there was a second source, and it was coming from the direction of the north barn, and it was too much smoke for any legitimate purpose. And Rebecca had the reins in her hands, and the horses moving before she consciously made the decision to run them. Silas was off the wagon before it fully stopped. He covered the ground between the wagon and the north barn at a run that covered the distance with a speed that was startling in a man his size, and Rebecca was right behind him, and Clem and Davis were already there with buckets from the stock tank, and the fire was in the hay storage attached to the north side of the barn. Not the main barn, not the animals, but the hay was 3 months of winter supply, and it was burning with the focused, specific intensity of something that had been deliberately set rather than accidentally started. They put it out. It took 40 minutes, and every hand on the property, and both wagon barrels of water, and the stock tank run down to its last foot of depth, and they put it out before it reached the main barn structure, but the hay was gone. All of it. Rebecca stood in the yard afterward with her dress smelling of smoke, and her hands black, and looked at what was left of the north storage, and calculated, automatically, exactly what the loss meant. 3 months of winter hay. The cattle operation through to the following spring, potentially compromised. The cost to replace it, if replacement was even possible at this point in the season. Davis said what everyone was thinking. That was set. No one disputed it. Silas was walking the perimeter of the burned structure with the focused, methodical attention of a man looking for specific evidence. He crouched near the north corner where the fire appeared to have begun and looked at something for a long time without touching it. Then he stood. Accelerant, he said. Someone poured something along the base of the north wall. He looked at Rebecca. This was Belle. We can't prove it, she said. No. His voice was very controlled, but we know it. She looked at the burned storage. She looked at the cattle in the far pasture, visible as dark shapes in the evening light, completely unaware that the equation of their winter feeding had just changed significantly. She thought about Belle watching the wagon leave that morning, calculating how long they would be gone, sending someone to the north barn while the property was reduced to a skeleton crew. He wasn't negotiating anymore. She turned to Clem. Get into Alder Creek first thing tomorrow. Find Deputy Marshal Crane at the post office. Tell him Miss Holloway has a report of deliberate property destruction to add to the Belle matter. She looked at the burned structure once more. And tell him we need him at the ranch before the end of the week. Clem nodded and went. She was not going to let him make her afraid. She was not going to let him make her reactive, pull her off the careful, documented, legally sound course she had constructed over the past weeks. She understood exactly what the fire was supposed to do. It was supposed to make her emotional, make Silas angry, push them toward a physical confrontation that Belle could use to reframe the narrative. An altercation. A threat. Something that moved the story from fraud investigation to property dispute between volatile parties, where Belle's lawyers could operate more comfortably. She went inside. She washed her hands. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote a detailed account of the fire with times and observations, and the note about the accelerant, signed and dated it, and put it with the other documents. Then she made supper for 5 men who smelled like smoke and needed to eat. Crane arrived on Friday. How was a compact man of about 50, with a weathered, unmemorable face that Rebecca recognized as specifically cultivated. The face of a man who had spent a career being underestimated in rooms where it was advantageous to be underestimated. He arrived without announcement, tied his horse at the fence, and walked to the front door and knocked with 3 businesslike knocks that communicated he was not there for socializing. Rebecca opened the door. He looked at her for exactly 1 second. Miss Holloway. Deputy Marshal Crane. Your documentation is the clearest private fraud analysis I have reviewed in my tenure. He said it without preamble, standing on the porch with his hat in his hands. I would like to review the originals, interview you at length about the methodology, and then I need to understand the current situation, including what you believe happened to your north barn 3 days ago. Come in, she said. "I have coffee, and I'll start at the beginning." He came in. Silas joined them after the first half hour, sitting quietly at the end of the table, in the way he had of occupying space without dominating it. Crane noted him, and then apparently filed him, and returned his attention to Rebecca, which she could see was a mark of professional focus rather than dismissal. Crane had identified immediately who in the room possessed the information he needed. She laid out everything. All of it. The full chronology from her father's payment to the transaction reference analysis, to the overlapping numbers the marshal's office had identified to Cotter's account of the original freight log to the fire. She presented each piece in the order it had emerged, explained her methodology for each, and produced originals where she had them. Crane examined the transaction reference analysis with a focus that suggested genuine technical engagement rather than polite attention. He asked precise questions. She gave precise answers. After 2 hours, he sat back and looked at her with the expression of a man arriving at a conclusion he had already suspected but needed to verify. Bell is going to argue that Cotter's original account, the one he prepared him to give, establishes the debt's legitimacy, even if the accounting records are irregular. "Cotter went to your office voluntarily 2 days ago," she said, with his truthful account. Crane nodded slowly. "I know. I interviewed him yesterday morning." He paused. "He is credible. More credible than Bell anticipated, I think, because his account of the original payment contains specific details. Your father's exact phrasing when he thanked him, the physical description of the receipt stamp, the time of day, that are not the kind of details a coached witness produces." He looked at her. Bell coached him on facts. He didn't account for the texture of genuine memory. Rebecca thought of her father saying thank you to a freight clerk for processing a receipt correctly, and the way that small human courtesy had preserved itself in a man's memory for 3 years and was now going to matter in a federal investigation, and she pressed her hand flat on the table and breathed once. "What happens now?" Silas said. It was the first thing he had said in 2 hours. Crane looked at him. "I issue a formal subpoena for Bell's original ledgers. I have authority to compel production within 72 hours. If those ledgers show what Miss Holloway's analysis predicts they'll show, we move to formal charges. Fraud, manipulation of territorial land records, bribery of a public official, that would be Deputy Greer, and deliberate destruction of property, pending investigation of the barn fire." He looked at Rebecca. "The property fraud cases, the affected families, are civil matters, and will require separate civil proceedings to recover land, but a criminal conviction against Bell on the fraud counts removes his legal standing to contest those proceedings. You understand that? The families won't get immediate answers," she said. "No, but they'll get them." He said it with the plainness of a man who did not make promises he couldn't keep, and was making this one because he could. "This case is substantial enough that the Territorial Attorney General will take a direct interest. The land recovery process will be expedited." She nodded. Crane gathered his papers and stood. "One more thing." He paused at the table edge. "I'm going to need you available for the duration of the investigation. It may be some weeks before formal proceedings begin. You'll be a key witness and potentially the principal analyst for the prosecution's documentation case." He looked at her. "Is that going to be a problem?" "No," she said. He put on his hat. "Then I'll be in contact. I'm moving to Alder Creek for the duration." He extended his hand. She shook it, and he held it for one firm second. "Miss Holloway, your father's name will be clear before this is finished. That's not a promise I make lightly." She let go of his hand. She looked at the table after he left. The lamp was burning. The documents were laid out in their careful order. Her father's ledger sat at the left edge of the table, worn at the corners, his handwriting visible in the open pages. The careful, honest figures of a man who had paid his debts and kept his records and thanked freight clerks by name and died not knowing that the proof of his honesty was sitting in his daughter's hands. She closed the ledger. She put her hand on the cover and held it there. Silas said nothing. He let her have the moment, the way he had been letting her have moments all along, making room without making absence, being near without being intrusive, understanding with some deep instinctive accuracy exactly how much space she needed and what kind. She looked up. He was watching her with the same direct, uncalculated attention that had unnerved her in the chicken coop and had somewhere, without a precise moment she could identify, become the look she trusted most in the world. "It's going to work," she said. Not a question. Not quite a statement. Something in between, the way things sound when you've fought for them long enough that their reality still feels slightly improbable. "Yes," he said. "Belle's lawyers will delay. Yes. It could still take months." "Yes." He said it with no diminishment, no attempt to soften or redirect. Just, yes, and it doesn't change anything. She stood up from the table. "I need to check the cattle records," she said. "If we've lost 3 months of hay, we need to begin calculating alternatives now, not in December when the options are already limited." He stood. "I'll get the pasture maps." "And Silas." She said it to his back as he moved toward the office. He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for Pryor's Way Station, for being on the wagon bench this morning without being asked, for all of it. I'm not certain I've said that clearly enough." He turned around. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the very first night, with that plain, unornamented directness, everything on the surface and nothing hidden beneath it. And he said, "You said it clearly enough." Then he went to get the pasture maps. She stood at the kitchen table for a moment longer, alone with the lamp and her father's ledger and the long Montana evening settling in through the window, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, because happiness was too simple a word for whatever this was, but a sense of ground. The sense of standing on something solid and having chosen to stand there. She picked up the ledger. She put it in the inside pocket of her coat, where she had carried it since the first night, and she went to the pantry and began calculating the winter feed alternatives with the same methodical focus she brought to everything, because the cattle still needed feeding, and the numbers still needed to be right, and there was still, as there was always, more work to do. 3 days later, Belle's lawyers filed a motion in the county court to compel the return of the Holloway farm on accelerated grounds, citing urgent commercial necessity. It was a desperate move, the kind of legal maneuver that looks aggressive on paper and is actually a man clearing his desk before the storm arrives. Crane filed a counter-motion in the territorial court the same day, superseding county jurisdiction. The county motion died within 24 hours. Belle's ledgers were subpoenaed on Monday. On Tuesday morning, Rebecca was gathering eggs from the chicken coop. She did this every morning, had done it since her first week on the property, and she was not going to stop doing it because of a federal investigation. When she heard boots on the path behind her and turned to find Silas standing in the coop doorway. He looked at her hands, at the eggs, at her face. "They found it," he said. "Crane sent word this morning. Belle's original ledger has a reference number registry, a master list. 47 reference numbers. All of them appear in loan documents for properties Belle acquired in the last 6 years. None of them correspond to legitimate transactions. The whole system is documented in Belle's own hand." Rebecca stood in the chicken coop with 3 warm eggs against her chest and looked at Silas Boone in the doorway, and the full weight of everything. Her father's name, the Holloway farm, Thomas Garrett's pasture, Clara Hendricks's husband's land, Jim Paulson's family, all the hands raised along the fence in the lamplight, settled over her, not like a burden, but like a thing finally set down. A weight you've carried so long, you've forgotten you're carrying it, and then you put it down, and your whole body recognizes the relief at once. She pressed the eggs carefully against her chest. "Well," she said. Her voice was steady. "We should tell Clem to get word to the families." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "We should," he said. "But first." She waited. He came 2 steps into the coop, filling the small space the way he filled every space, not aggressively, but completely. And he looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before. Not the steady practicality, not the quiet attention, not the careful measure of a man who processed everything slowly and decided everything well. Something more open than any of that. Something that had been building for a long time in a man who did not rush anything and had apparently decided that today was the day he stopped waiting. "When this is finished," he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "Ask me now." He held her gaze. "When this is finished," he said again, deliberately, "I want to give you the choice I gave you the first night, properly, without the circumstances that made it complicated." He paused. "You deserve to choose freely, not desperate, not grateful, free." She looked at him for a long time. 3 eggs warm against her chest, hay dust in the air, morning light coming through the coop walls. "All right," she said. He nodded. He stepped back to the doorway. And then, because he was Silas, and this was apparently the closest he came to sentiment in the morning, he said, "Crane also said Bell is expected to surrender himself to the marshal's office in Alder Creek by end of week." "Good," she said. She turned back to the nest boxes. "Go tell Clem." She heard what might have been the beginning of something in his voice, something quiet and real and entirely his own, before he went back toward the barn. She gathered the rest of the eggs. She carried them to the kitchen. She made breakfast for 5 men and a federal investigation and the memory of her father. And outside the window the Montana morning was wide and clear and entirely, astonishingly open. And Rebecca Holloway, who had arrived on this mountain with 3 stolen eggs and splitting shoes and 37 cents and nothing left to lose, stood at the stove and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, like a woman who had everything she needed. She still didn't have her father back. She still didn't have the farmhouse, but she had her father's name. And she was beginning to understand that some things, once recovered, are worth more than the things that were lost alongside them. Horace Bell surrendered to Deputy Marshal Crane on a Thursday morning. Rebecca was not there to see it. She had considered going, had sat with the thought for 2 days, turning it over the way you turn over something with sharp edges, trying to determine whether witnessing it would give her something or simply cost her something. In the end, she decided against it. She didn't need to watch Bell walk into the marshal's custody to know it had happened. She didn't need to see his face in the moment his authority finally, definitively, ran out. She had seen enough of his face. She was finished with it. What she needed that morning, she discovered, was to gather eggs. She went to the co-op at first light the way she did every morning, and she moved through it with the same quiet efficiency she had developed over months. And the hens shifted and muttered and regarded her with their amber eyes. And the hay smelled like hay. And everything was exactly what it was. She carried the eggs to the kitchen. She lit the stove. She made coffee and stood at the window while it came up to heat, and watched the valley fill slowly with morning light, and she thought about her father. She thought about him the way she had been allowing herself to think about him more often lately. Not the grief version. Not the version where the thinking was really just a form of anger at what had been taken, but the real version. The man who had built a kitchen table with his own hands and sat at it every morning for 30 years. The man who had kept his accounts in a careful hand and paid every debt he owed and thanked freight clerks by name. The man who had told her, again and again, in the patient way of a father who understood that some lessons only arrive through repetition, "Don't let them see you break, Becca. People will take whatever you show them and use it against you later." She had not broken. She pressed her hand flat on the window frame and let herself feel that for a moment. Not triumph. Triumph was too loud for what this was. Something quieter. Something that had to do with continuity, with the fact that what her father had built in her had held, had carried the weight of everything that had happened, and had not given way. "Coffee's ready," Silas said from behind her. She hadn't heard him come in. She almost had, but the last few months had made her attuned to his particular way of moving, large and unhurried, the kind of physical presence that announced itself not through sound, but through some change in the quality of the air. And she had almost registered it, and then let it go, because his presence had become something she no longer felt the need to be alert to. It was simply there, like the stove, like the valley outside the window. She turned around. He poured 2 cups and set them on the table and sat down, and she sat across from him, and they drank their coffee in the morning quiet, the way they had been doing for months. And it was comfortable in a way that had long since stopped surprising her and had simply become the texture of her days. "Crane sent a rider," Silas said. Belle is in custody. The surrender was without incident. She nodded. He also said the Territorial Attorney General's office is opening civil proceedings for the affected properties. It'll take time. He said that clearly. Don't expect it to move fast. But the framework is in place. Thomas Garrett's pasture, she said. First on the list, apparently. Crane said the documentation for that one is particularly clean. She looked at her cup. Clara Hendricks. Her husband's family land is in the second batch. More complicated title history, but Crane said workable. He paused. Jim Paulson's account is being reviewed. The papers he brought to the fence that night, apparently they're significant. She thought about Jim Paulson, holding up that folded document in the lamplight, his voice carrying across the yard. I got papers that didn't look right at the time, and I kept them. And the way that single instinct, a man keeping papers because something didn't sit right, had added another thread to the web she had been building. People know more than they think they know, she said. They see things and file them away because they don't have a framework for what they're seeing. Give them the framework, and they remember everything. Silas looked at her. You gave them the framework. My father gave me the framework, she said. I just used it. I was quiet for a moment. Then. Crane also said the trial date will likely be set for late winter. He wants you available as a witness, and he specifically said, and again I'm quoting directly because he was particular about his words. He said, tell Miss Holloway that the prosecution's case is built almost entirely on her documentation, and that we consider her the most valuable civilian participant in a territorial fraud prosecution this office has conducted. Rebecca sat with that for a moment. She wasn't sure what to do with it exactly. Compliments had a way of arriving and then standing there requiring some kind of response, and she had never been particularly fluent in receiving them. Tell Crane I'll be available, she said finally. And tell him the documentation is organized chronologically with cross-references in the back pages of the analysis. If his lawyers need help navigating it, I'm happy to walk them through. Silas almost smiled. I'll tell him you said that. The weeks that followed were both quieter and fuller than anything that had come before. The investigation was ongoing, but its momentum was no longer dependent on Rebecca's direct action. She had built the engine, and now it was running, and her role had shifted from constructor to witness, which left her with something she hadn't had in a very long time. Space. Space to look up from the ledger and notice the October turning the aspens along the ridge. Space to spend a full afternoon teaching Davis how to calculate feed ratios without him getting defensive about it, which took patience but rewarded it. Space to sit on the porch in the evening when the work was done and simply be somewhere without a specific purpose, demanding her attention. She was sitting on the porch on one of those evenings, 3 weeks after Belle's surrender, when Clara Hendricks came up the valley road. She came alone, in a small wagon, and she pulled up at the fence and tied the horse and walked to the porch with her hands folded in front of her, and her face wearing the complicated expression of someone who has been rehearsing something for a while and is no longer sure the rehearsal was sufficient. Rebecca stood up. Clara Hendricks was perhaps 45, with a weathered, capable face and the particular posture of a woman who had been managing hard circumstances for long enough that management had become her natural resting state. She looked at Rebecca for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "My mother-in-law was born on that land. She homesteaded it with my husband's father in 1861. She buried 2 children there." She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. "When we lost it, I thought that was the end of that story. I thought some stories just ended that way, no matter how wrong it was." Rebecca waited. "I wanted to come and tell you," Clara said, "that I was wrong. About the ending." She paused. "And to thank you for being the kind of woman who could see what the rest of us couldn't see and do something about it when the rest of us had given up." Rebecca looked at her. She thought about the right thing to say, and then she decided the right thing was the true thing. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "Not in the way people mean when they say someone was brave. I had a ledger and a head for numbers and nothing left to lose. Sometimes those 3 things together are the most dangerous combination in the world." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she did something Rebecca hadn't expected. She laughed, a real laugh, short and sudden, the laugh of someone who has been tightly wound for a long time and just felt something release. "Maybe so," she said. "But you're the one who put them together." She left a jar of preserved plums on the porch railing and drove back down the road. Rebecca stood with the jar in her hands for a long time after the wagon disappeared. Thomas Garrett came the following week. He didn't bring anything, and he didn't make a speech. He pulled up at the fence and said, "Crane says we might have the pasture back by spring." And when Rebecca said she hoped so, he said, "I believe it," with the flat certainty of a man who has rearranged his understanding of what is possible and is not going back to the previous arrangement. Then he drove away. Jim Paulson sent a letter. It was short and had several spelling errors, and it was one of the most sincere things she had ever read. Cotter came once, briefly, to tell her he had given his full testimony to the prosecution, and that he had been granted a limited immunity in exchange for cooperation, and that he was leaving the territory for Oregon. He shook her hand at the door and held it for a moment, the way people hold things they know they're setting down for the last time. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Holloway," he said. "You did a brave thing," she told him, "whatever came before it." He nodded, and he left, and she never saw him again. The trial was set for February. By the time November arrived, Rebecca had been on the Boone property for 5 months. She became aware of this fact on a specific Tuesday evening when she was updating the winter supply ledger, and looked at the date and then looked at her handwriting. At the particular way she wrote her figures, the small efficient numerals her father had taught her, filling the columns of Silas Boone's household accounts. And she understood that something had happened that she had not noticed happening, which was the most reliable sign that something was entirely real. She had stopped thinking of this as a temporary arrangement. She did not know precisely when it had shifted. There was no single moment she could point to, not the night she found the transaction reference pattern, not the night Bell's riders came to the yard, not the morning Hatch came back from Helena with Crane's letter. It had been accumulative, a thing built slowly out of mornings with coffee and evenings with lamplight, and the particular quality of a man's presence that asked nothing and gave consistently and kept every promise it made without calling attention to the keeping. She thought about what Silas had said in the chicken coop the morning Bell surrendered. "When this is finished, I want to give you the choice I gave you the first night, properly, without the circumstances that made it complicated." The circumstances were, if not entirely gone, considerably simplified. Bell was in custody. The investigation was concluded. The trial would proceed without requiring her daily attention. Hatch was back, and the hands had settled into their winter rhythm, and the ranch was running with the comfortable efficiency of an operation that had found its proper shape. She was free. Not the way she had dreamed of being free when she was sitting on her father's porch watching Bell drive away with a forged piece of paper. Not free from circumstances, because circumstances were always going to exist. But free in the specific, solid, meaningful sense of a person who has stood on her own 2 feet and proven to herself and everyone watching that she could stand there, indefinitely, without assistance. That was the freedom that mattered. She closed the supply ledger. She went to find Silas. Howe was in the barn, working on a section of corral fence that had developed a weak post. He did this kind of work the way he did all physical work, with a focused, unhurried competence. No wasted motion, no impatience with the process. He heard her come in and looked up, and she saw in his face the same thing she had been seeing for weeks. That particular quality of attention he reserved for her, different from the attention he gave to everything else. Not more intense, but more open, like a window he had cleared the frost from. She stood 6 feet from him, with her hands at her sides. "You said when this was finished," she said. He set down the tool he was holding, gave her his full attention. "It's finished enough," she said. "I'm standing here freely, not desperate, not grateful, or not only grateful, that's more complicated, but free. Making a choice because I want to make it and for no other reason." She paused. "So if you wanted to ask me something, Silas, now would be the time." He looked at her for a long moment. The barn was quiet around them. Outside, the first thin snow of winter was beginning to fall. She could hear it in the changed quality of the silence, the particular hush that descends when the first flakes are in the air. "Rebecca Holloway," he said. His voice was exactly what it always was, low and steady and absolutely sincere. No performance in it, no decoration. Just the plain, honest weight of what he meant. "I am asking you to wear white beside me. Not because you need somewhere to be, and not because I'm useful to you, and not because the circumstances made it convenient. Because you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and because every morning for 5 months I have been grateful that you put those eggs back." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to be less than you are," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop keeping my accounts or telling me when I'm wrong about the hay distribution or writing letters that terrify federal agencies into doing their jobs. I'm asking you to do all of those things as my wife, in a house that is yours as much as mine, for as long as you want to be here." He paused. "And if someday you decide you want to go somewhere else and do something else, I will pack the wagon myself." She crossed the remaining distance between them and stood directly in front of him and looked up at his face. The long dark hair, the thick beard, the weathered, honest face of a man who had been alone on a mountain for 9 years and had apparently spent that time becoming exactly the person she needed to find. "You won't need to pack the wagon," she said. "No?" "No." She held his gaze. "Yes, Silas. My answer is yes." He reached out and took her hand with the careful, deliberate gentleness of a man who understood that the thing he was holding was not fragile, but was precious, which was a different thing entirely. They stood like that in the barn, while the first snow of winter fell outside, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. The wedding was in December, on a Saturday, when the snow had settled properly over the valley and the pines were heavy with it, and the mountain sky was the particular pale blue of a cold, clear winter day. There was no grand ceremony. There was a preacher from the Alder Creek Church who had a kind face and sensible shoes and didn't use more words than the occasion required. There were neighbors, the Garretts, Clara Hendricks, Jim Paulson with his wife and 3 children who had no understanding of the legal proceedings, but a complete understanding that this was a celebration and behaved accordingly. There were 4 ranch hands in their best shirts, all of them cleaned up to various degrees of success. Hatch with his hat off, and Davis with his hair parted in a direction it clearly did not naturally go. Clem Marsh cried. He denied it immediately and comprehensively and with great conviction, but he cried. Rebecca wore white. A simple dress she had made herself over 3 weeks of evening work while Silas was doing the night checks, using the good fabric she had found in the Alder Creek dry goods store, and her mother's sewing kit that she had carried all the way from the farm in her battered canvas bag. She had not told Silas about the dress. She had kept it wrapped in cloth in the back of the wardrobe in her room, and when she came out of the house on the morning of the wedding, she watched his face and saw exactly what she had hoped to see. Not just appreciation, though that was there, but something deeper, a recognition, as if he was seeing in the white dress the full weight of what it meant that she had chosen to put it on. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the barn, plain and open and entirely real. "You made that," he said. "I did." "When?" "While you were doing the night checks." He was quiet for a moment. "You made your wedding dress in secret while I was walking the fence line." "I did." Something moved across his face. "Rebecca," he said, in the same register he used for everything that mattered, quiet and complete. "That might be the most—" "Don't make a speech about it," she said. "We have a preacher waiting." He offered her his arm. She took it. They stood under the Montana winter sky in front of their neighbors and their hands, and a preacher with sensible shoes, and they said what they meant, and meant what they said. And when it was done, Silas Boone held his wife's hand with the careful, deliberate tenderness of a man who had waited a long time for something and intended to be worthy of it. The celebration lasted most of the afternoon. Rebecca's pies, 3 of them, apple and dried cherry, and a beef and onion savory that Clem Marsh ate approximately a third of by himself, were consumed entirely. Clara Hendricks brought preserved goods. Thomas Garrett brought whiskey. He apologized for, and everyone drank anyway. Jim Paulson's oldest boy fell asleep under the kitchen table, and his parents didn't notice for 40 minutes. Davis, at some point during the afternoon, cornered Rebecca near the kitchen doorway, with the earnest urgency of a 19-year-old who had arrived at a conclusion he considered important. "Ma'am," he said, "I just want to say, when I got here in September and you told me what you were going to do, about Belle, about all of it, I didn't think it was going to work. I thought, well, I'm not proud of what I thought. You thought a woman with a ledger wasn't going to be able to take down a man with armed riders and a deputy in his pocket," she said. Davis winced. "Yes, ma'am." "That's all right," she said. "Most people thought that, including Belle. I know that now." He looked at her with the particular expression of a young person in the process of revising a fundamental assumption. "I just wanted to say I know it." She looked at him for a moment. "Davis, you ran to find me when you saw the riders coming. You went to get Clem when Belle was in the yard. You carried buckets for 40 minutes when the barn was burning." She paused. "What you thought didn't matter much. What you did was what counted." He straightened slightly, nodded, went back to the celebration. Hatch found her on the porch later in the afternoon, standing in the cold for a moment of quiet, while the house hummed with voices behind her. He came to stand beside her with his hat in his hands, and they looked at the valley together. Snow on the pastures, cattle moving in their slow, patient circles far down the slope, the line of pines against the pale winter sky. "You know," he said, after a while, "I've worked cattle across 4 territories, seen a considerable number of difficult situations get resolved and not resolved." He paused. "Never seen one resolved quite the way this one was." "With a ledger and a pen," she said. "With a ledger and a pen," he confirmed, with a satisfaction in his voice that made her want to laugh. 30 years of cowboying, and I rode to Helena for a woman who sorted out a federal fraud case with arithmetic. That's a story I'm going to be telling for a considerable time." "Tell it accurately," she said. "Always do, ma'am." He put his hat back on. "Always do." The winter settled in. Belle's trial was held in February as scheduled, and the prosecution's case, built almost entirely on Rebecca's documentation, Cotter's voluntary testimony, and the fraudulent reference number registry found in Belle's own handwriting, required 11 days to present and 4 hours for the jury to consider. The verdict was not a surprise to anyone who had examined the evidence. Belle was convicted on 7 counts of fraud, 2 counts of bribery, and 1 count of deliberate property destruction. His sentence was substantial. The Belle Merchant and Land Trust was dissolved by order of the territorial court. Its assets were liquidated. The civil proceedings for the affected properties moved faster than Crane had predicted, in part because the criminal conviction removed every legal barrier Belle's lawyers had been using to stall. Thomas Garrett had his pasture restored by late spring. Clara Hendricks's family land was formally returned in June, and Clara wrote Rebecca a letter that was 2 pages long and contained 1 sentence that Rebecca kept. "You made us believe the story could still go a different way, and that belief is the beginning of everything." The Holloway farm was a more complicated matter. The farmhouse had deteriorated significantly during the months it had sat empty and unmanaged after Belle's acquisition. The territorial court restored the title to the Holloway estate, which was now legally Rebecca Boone, née Holloway, and she drove out to look at it on a March morning with Silas on the wagon bench beside her. She stood in the yard of her father's farm for a long time. The kitchen table was still inside. She could see it through the window. Her father had built it to last, and it had lasted. Everything else was in various states of damage from a Montana winter of neglect. Silas stood beside her and said nothing. She looked at the farmhouse. She looked at the kitchen table through the window. She thought about her father sitting at it every morning for 30 years, keeping his accounts, drinking his coffee, being a man of complete and uncomplicated honesty in a world that had not rewarded him for it the way it should have. "I don't want to live here," she said. "I want to be clear about that. My life is in the valley now. Our life." "I know," Silas said, "but I want it to stand." She looked at the farmhouse. "I want it repaired and maintained. I want the Holloway name on the deed, and I want to keep it. Not to sell. Not to let fall down." She paused. "Because some things need to stand. As a record. As proof that something happened and that it was set right." Silas looked at the farmhouse. "We can have it repaired by summer. I know we can." She turned back toward the wagon. I want to hire someone from Alder Creek to do it. Someone who needs the work. Give them a fair wage and put it in writing and make sure they understand exactly what I expect and exactly what they'll receive." He helped her up to the wagon bench. "You're going to do that with everything, aren't you?" he said. Not a question. The tone of a man who has identified a pattern and finds it entirely consistent with everything he already knows. Fair wages and written agreements? She took the reins. Yes, every time. She looked at him sideways. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. "It is not." They drove back to the valley. Spring arrived, the way spring always arrives in Montana. Not gradually, but suddenly, one morning, as if the season had been waiting just behind the ridge and had finally decided to come through. The aspens went from bare to green in what felt like 48 hours. The cattle moved differently. The light changed. The valley opened up and became itself again after months of being muted under snow. Rebecca expanded the kitchen. She had been thinking about it since October, when she had looked at the kitchen and realized that what she was already doing, the cooking, the preserving, the feeding of hands and guests, and the occasional neighbor who came to discuss something and stayed for a meal, was not a side activity, but a central one, and that a central activity deserved a proper space. She presented Silas with a sketch one evening that was really more of an architectural proposal, complete with measurements and a materials list and a rough cost estimate. He looked at it for a long time. "You drew this yourself," he said. "Last Tuesday when you were doing the south fence." He looked at the measurements. "These are accurate." "I paced them off." "Of course you did." He set the sketch down. "What do you want to do with the expanded space?" She told him. "A larger stove, proper workspace, a service window facing the wagon trail for travelers crossing the mountain route, because the mountain route was growing busier as more people moved into the territory, and people crossing mountains needed to eat, and she could feed them and charge them fairly and keep accounts that were accurate down to the last cent." Silas listened to all of it. Then he said, "That's a business." "Yes." "You're starting a business. I'm expanding a function I'm already performing and creating a revenue structure around it." She paused. "Yes, that's a business." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want no part of managing it." She looked at him. "It's yours," he said. "Build it how you want it. Run it how you want it. Keep your own accounts for it." He paused. "I'll build whatever you need built." She looked at the sketch. "You'll need to take down part of the east kitchen wall." "I know. And rebuild the chimney flue on the west side." "I know." "It'll take most of April." "I know." He looked at her. "Rebecca, I said I'd build what you need. I don't need a list." She handed him the sketch with the measurements on it. "You do, actually," she said. "Those are load-bearing specifications. Don't improvise." Hy took the sketch. He did not improvise. He built exactly what she specified, with the same focused, unhurried competence he brought to everything physical. And by the end of April, the kitchen was expanded, and the service window was installed, and the sign that Rebecca painted herself went up on the post beside the wagon trail. Boone and Holloway, Ranch and Table. She kept her family name on it deliberately and without apology, because the name needed to be there. Because Samuel Holloway's name needed to be somewhere visible and permanent in a territory that had spent the last 6 years pretending his honesty hadn't existed. Because she was Rebecca Boone, and she was also Rebecca Holloway, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and she wasn't going to resolve the tension by discarding one of them. Silas looked at the sign for a long time when she put it up. "Holloway comes first," he observed. "Boone comes first," she said. "Read the order again." He read it. Boone and Holloway. Alphabetical. She looked at the sign. "It happens to be alphabetical, that's all." He looked at her profile. "Of course it does," he said, and the warmth in his voice was so complete and so unguarded that she turned to look at him, and whatever was on his face made her want to laugh and not laugh simultaneously. The feeling of being known so precisely by one person that precision itself becomes a form of tenderness. "Don't make it into something," she said. "Wouldn't dream of it," he said. "The dining house," which was what people started calling it, Because the sign said, "Table," and table implied hospitality, and hospitality implied a place you could sit down, became known throughout the county within a season. Rebecca's beef stew, her apple pie, her dried cherry preserves, her biscuits with the specific quality of biscuits made by a person who has been making them since childhood, and has never once stopped caring whether they were right. These things traveled by word of mouth the way all truly good things travel, which is to say, without any particular effort from the person who made them, through the simple mechanism of people telling other people about an experience they wanted to be sure those people didn't miss. By the following spring, there were days when the service window had a line. She hired Clara Hendricks's daughter to help on those days, and paid her a wage she put in writing, and taught her to keep her own accounts. And then she began doing the other thing. The thing she had thought about since the day she sat across from Thomas Garrett in the lamplight and explained transaction reference numbers to a man who had been watching his family's land disappear without knowing why. She began helping people understand contracts before they signed them. Quietly at first, a neighbor came to her with a document, and she read it and explained what the language meant in plain terms. And then less quietly, as the word spread, that there was a woman in the valley who could look at a piece of paper and tell you exactly what was in it and what it would cost you if you signed it. She was not a lawyer. She was careful to say so every time. She told people, "I am not a lawyer. I am a woman who understands numbers and language, and who has spent considerable time learning exactly how those things can be used against people who don't know how to read them. I can tell you what a document says. I cannot tell you what to do about it. The decision is always yours." People came anyway. Women mostly, at first. Widows, young wives managing property in their husbands' absences. Women who had been handed documents and told to sign without being given time to read. Then men, once the word got around that the reading was honest and the advice was practical and there was no charge for it, only the expectation that you would come back and tell her what happened. Silas built her a small room off the dining house for these consultations. He built it without being asked, one morning in the fall of the second year, and when she came out and found it, he said simply, "You needed a space for the documents work." She looked at the room. "You built me an office." "I built you a room," he said. "You can call it whatever you want." She called it the document room. The sign above the door said, in her own hand, in letters she made clear and legible and completely without ornamentation, "Holloway Document Services. Not Boone. Holloway." Silas read the sign and said nothing. His expression said everything she needed to hear. Years passed the way. Years pass when a life is full of things that matter, quickly in experience and slowly in memory, so that when you look back, the texture is dense and rich, and it's difficult to identify the individual threads that made it. Rebecca Boone, née Holloway, gathered eggs every morning and kept impeccable accounts, and made biscuits that people drove considerable distances for, and read contracts for women who didn't know what they'd signed, and kept the Holloway name visible and permanent in a county that had tried to erase it. Silas Boone expanded his cattle operation steadily, consulted his wife on every financial decision, built whatever she asked him to build, and was regarded throughout the county as either the most intimidating man in the territory or the most quietly content, depending on which version of him you encountered and under what circumstances. One morning in the autumn of their 4th year, the aspens gone gold, the first cold coming down off the ridge, the smell of wood smoke and dried apples, and the particular seasonal clarity of a Montana fall. Silas came into the kitchen and found Rebecca at the coop, visible through the window, gathering eggs the way she did every single morning of every year, moving through it with the same sure, unhurried efficiency that characterized everything she did. He watched her through the window. She came back inside with the eggs in her apron and found him standing at the kitchen table with his coffee and his arms crossed, and the expression she had long since learned to read as his version of being caught at something. She looked at the eggs. She looked at him. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't say whatever you're about to say about the eggs." He raised an eyebrow, the expression he used when he was going to say it anyway. "Stealing from me again, Mrs. Boone?" She set the eggs on the counter with great dignity. "You married the thief," she said. "That's your problem. He looked at her, the way he had looked at her in the chicken coop doorway, the very first morning, when she had been trembling and starving, and protecting 3 stolen eggs against her chest. With the same steadiness, the same clear attention, the same plain, honest recognition of the person in front of him. Except now, the recognition was layered with 4 years of mornings and evenings and documents and arguments about hay distribution, and a white dress made in secret, and a sign that said, Boone and Holloway, and a small room with a door that said, Holloway Document Services, and every promise kept, and every word meant. "Best bargain I ever made," he said. She looked at him. She felt the full weight of everything the words carried. Not just the moment, not just the morning, but all of it. The whole accumulation of what they had built together out of 3 stolen eggs and a ledger, and a man who had offered her a choice when the world had taken every choice from her. What began in a chicken coop in the Montana mountains, on a desperate September afternoon, had become something neither of them had dared to name when it was starting. Not a rescue, because she had rescued herself before he ever had the chance. Not a debt, because he had been careful from the first morning to make sure she owed him nothing. And not a convenience, because convenience doesn't survive 4 winters and a federal trial, and arguments about feed ratios, and a sign painted by hand in the cold. It was a home. Built by 2 people who had each, in their own separate way, spent years learning how to stand alone, and who had finally discovered that standing together required neither of them to be less than what they were. Rebecca Holloway had walked onto this mountain with 37 cents and splitting shoes, and a head full of numbers, and nothing left to lose. She had left with everything, and every morning, without fail, she went to gather the eggs. Because some things, once earned, you do not take for granted, and because the woman who had once been hungry enough to steal 3 of them understood, in the particular deep way of people who have known the exact weight of nothing, precisely what it meant to have enough.